I'm Rolando McGregor, 32, a Marine veteran who served 3 tours in Afghanistan. While I was lying unconscious in a military hospital, fragments of an IED still embedded in my skull. My parents walked into my apartment and sold my Bronze Star, Purple Heart, and Combat Action Ribbon on eBay for $847. I woke up from brain surgery to find my most sacred possessions, earned through blood, brotherhood, and sacrifice gone to the highest bidder. My mother's justification: you weren't using them anyway, and we needed the money for groceries. But what they didn't know was that those medals weren't just mine to lose. Hidden behind my Purple Heart citation was something that would expose 20 years of their lies and change our family forever. If you've ever been betrayed by those who should protect you most, this story will resonate with every scar on your heart. The fluorescent lights of Walter Reed Medical Center had become my unwelcome companions for 3 weeks. Each morning they flickered to life with the same mechanical indifference, casting harsh shadows across the sterile room where I'd been fighting to remember my own name. The doctors said I was lucky if you could call surviving an IED blast. That turned 2 of my Marines into memories and left shrapnel dancing around my brainstem. Lucky Nurse Rodriguez had been my anchor during the worst of it, when the headaches made me forget where I was, when the nightmares dragged me back to that dusty road outside Helmand Province. She was there with her steady voice and gentle hands. So when she mentioned the visitors during my first week I barely remembered, but I paid attention. Your parents came by several times, she said, checking my IV drip. Nice people. They were so worried about you. They brought some boxes from your apartment. Said they wanted to keep your important things safe while you recovered. Boxes from my apartment. The words triggered something cold in my chest. I hadn't given anyone permission to go through my belongings. Hell, I'd been unconscious for the first 10 days. Breathing through a ventilator while surgeons picked metal fragments out of my skull like some macabre puzzle. What kind of boxes? I asked, my voice still rough from the intubation. Personal effects, they said. Pictures, documents. Your mum mentioned something about keeping your military decorations safe. She seemed very concerned about them being stolen from your apartment while you were away. Military decorations. My medals. The Bronze Star I'd earned pulling Corporal Jenkins from a burning Humvee. The Purple Heart that came with watching my best friend bleed out in my arms. The Combat Action Ribbon that marked me as one of the few who'd actually pulled the trigger when it mattered. I reached for the phone. With shaking hands. My parents had driven for hours from our small town in Ohio to visit me twice. According to the nurses, they'd brought flowers, tears, and apparently, they'd brought boxes. I dialed home, my fingers moving automatically through numbers I'd memorized as a child. Hello. My mother's voice was cautious, distant. Mom, it's me, Rolando. Oh, honey. The relief in her voice seemed genuine. How are you feeling? The doctors said you might have some memory problems. I'm fine, Mom. Listen, the nurse said you guys took some boxes from my apartment. Silence stretched across the line. I could hear my father's television in the background, the familiar drone of afternoon talk shows. We were just keeping your things safe, sweetheart. You know how that neighborhood can be. We didn't want anyone breaking in while you were in the hospital. What things specifically? Another pause. Longer this time. Just some papers and some of your military things. Your father thought they'd be safer at our house. My medals. Yes, your medals too. Don't worry about any of that right now. You just focus on getting better. But something in her tone, too bright, too quick, made my stomach clench. My mother had never shown interest in my military service before. She'd been vocally opposed to my enlistment, had refused to attend my graduation from boot camp, and had never once asked about my deployments. The idea that she was now concerned about the safety of my medals felt wrong, like a uniform that didn't fit. I'll pick them up when I get discharged, I said. Of course, honey, we'll have everything ready for you. After I hung up, I stared at the ceiling for a long time. The shrapnel in my head chose that moment to remind me of its presence, sending lightning bolts of pain through my skull. But underneath the physical agony was something worse, a creeping suspicion that felt like betrayal before I even had proof. 3 days later, when the doctors finally cleared me for discharge, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of calling my parents to pick me up, I called a cab. I wanted to see my apartment first. I wanted to understand what keeping things safe actually meant. The ride through DC traffic gave me too much time to think. Too much time to remember fragments of conversations and half-formed doubts. My parents had always been struggling. Financially, Dad's construction work had dried up after the 2008 crash. and Mom's part-time job at the grocery store barely covered their mortgage. They'd ask me for money before small amounts, always with promises to pay it back that never materialized. But my medals, those weren't just money. Those were pieces of my soul, tangible proof that I'd served something bigger than myself. They were reminders of friends who'd never made it home, of moments when I'd been brave enough to matter. The cab pulled up to my building just as the sun was setting, painting the sky the color of desert sand. I climbed the stairs slowly, my balance still uncertain, and fumbled with my keys. The door swung open to reveal my apartment exactly as I'd left it, except for the spaces where my medals used to hang. The empty display case on my living room wall stared back at me like a missing tooth. I'd mounted it there 3 years ago when I'd returned from my final deployment, carefully arranging each medal with the precision drilled into me at Paris Island. The bronze star in the center, flanked by my Purple Heart and combat action ribbon. Below them, my deployment ribbons and unit citations, each one a chapter in the story of who I'd become. Now there was nothing but dust outlines on the red felt backing, and a few stray pins that had been forgotten in the rush to strip my life bare. I moved through the apartment like a ghost haunting his own life. The furniture was still there, my second-hand couch, the coffee table I'd built from reclaimed wood, the bookshelf filled with military histories and Tom Clancy novels. But everywhere I looked, I found evidence of intrusion. Drawers were closed, just slightly wrong. Papers were stacked with a neatness that wasn't mine. Someone had been here, and they'd been thorough. The bedroom was worse. My dresser drawers hung open an inch, their contents rifled through and hastily reorganized. My desk, where I kept my important papers in a manila folder marked military records, had been completely cleaned out. Not just the medals, but everything. My DD-214 discharge papers, my medical records, even my grandfather's funeral program from 2 years ago. I sank onto my bed, the mattress creaking under my weight, and tried to process what I was seeing. This wasn't parents worried about burglary. This was systematic. Calculated. They'd taken specific things, leaving behind anything that wouldn't have value to someone else. My hands shook as I reached for my phone again. Before I could dial, I noticed something glinting under my bed. I knelt carefully. Sudden movements still triggered vertigo and found a single pin that had rolled under the frame. It was the backing pin from my Purple Heart, the tiny piece of metal that held the medal to its ribbon. Such a small thing, but holding it felt like holding a lifeline. I'd earned that Purple Heart on a road outside Sangin, when Corporal Martinez stepped on an IED, and I'd thrown myself over him to shield him from the secondary blast. The shrapnel had torn through my shoulder and arm, but Martinez had lived. That medal wasn't decoration, it was proof that sometimes courage means bleeding for someone else. And my parents had sold it for grocery money. I was still sitting there, clutching the pin, when I noticed something else. Behind where my Purple Heart had hung, there was a small envelope taped to the back of the display case. My hands trembled as I peeled it away, finding my own handwriting on the front, just in case. Inside was a folded document I'd almost forgotten about. It was a letter from my grandfather's insurance company, dated 6 months after his death. The letter that had started everything. The one that had made me understand why my parents' financial troubles had suddenly disappeared right after Grandpa Joe's funeral. The document was a beneficiary notification, informing me that I was the sole beneficiary of a life insurance policy worth $850,000. The letter explained that monthly payments of $3,200 would begin within 60 days, continuing for 20 years until the full amount was distributed. It was dated nearly 5 years ago. I read it 3 times before the implications hit me like another IED blast. That my parents hadn't just stolen my medals. They'd been stealing my inheritance for years. The room spun as I tried to do the math. If they'd been collecting $3,200 every month for 5 years, they'd already taken over $190,000 that belonged to me. Money that should have been helping me transition to civilian life, maybe buy a house, go to college. Money that could have changed everything. The grocery receipts my mother had mentioned suddenly made sense. She hadn't just been justifying the medal sales, she'd been practicing her lie, preparing for the moment when I discovered the bigger theft. The medals were supposed to be a distraction, a smaller crime to hide the massive one. I stumbled to the bathroom and threw up until there was nothing left. When I finally looked in the mirror, I saw a stranger. The scar from my surgery ran along my hairline like a lightning bolt, and my eyes held something new, not just the 1,000-yard stare of combat, but the hollow look of someone who'd been betrayed by the people who were supposed to protect him. My parents had come to Walter Reed while I was fighting for my life, and they'd used my unconsciousness as an opportunity to rob me. They'd sat by my bedside, held my hand, cried tears that I'd believed were real, and then they'd systematically stripped away everything that mattered to me. The worst part wasn't even the money, it was the timing. While surgeons were removing fragments of Afghanistan from my skull, while I was trapped in nightmares where my friends died over and over again, my own parents were in my apartment, packing up the symbols of my service like they were garage sale items. I called them again, but this time I was ready for their lies. Mom, I'm at my apartment. Oh, good, honey. How are you feeling? Do you need us to come help you settle back in? Where are my medals? The pause was shorter this time, but still there. They're safe, sweetheart. We have them right here. I want them back tonight. Of course, we can bring them by this weekend, when your father's feeling better. He threw his back out at work. No, tonight, or I'm calling the police. Her voice changed, becoming sharp and defensive. Rolando, there's no need to be dramatic. We were trying to help you. Maybe the surgery affected your thinking more than we realized. There it was, the gaslighting I remembered from childhood. When I'd complained about anything, it was always my fault, always my misunderstanding. But this time, I had evidence. I found the insurance papers. Mom. The silence stretched so long, I wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, she spoke, and her voice was different, smaller. Caught. I don't know what you're talking about. Grandfather's life insurance policy. The one that's been paying you $3,200 a month for the past 5 years. The money that was supposed to be mine. I heard her suck in a sharp breath. Heard my father's voice in the background asking what was wrong. We can explain everything, she said finally. It's complicated, but we can explain. Then explain it. Right now. But she'd already hung up. They showed up at my door 2 hours later. My mother clutching a manila envelope, and my father trailing behind her like a whipped dog. Mom had dressed for the occasion, her best church outfit, and the expression she used to wear when explaining why I couldn't have the toys other kids had. Dad looked like he wanted to be anywhere else in the world. Can we come in? Mom asked, her voice artificially bright. I stepped aside without a word, watching as they settled uncomfortably on my couch. The space where my medals should have been hung between us like an accusation. First, let's clear up this misunderstanding. About the insurance, Mom began, opening the envelope with practiced efficiency. She pulled out a stack of grocery receipts, utility bills, and what looked like medical statements. We've been keeping track of every penny we spent on your behalf. She spread the papers across my coffee table like evidence in a trial. This is from February 8, $147 for groceries. When we bought food for your apartment, so you'd have something to eat when you came home. This is from March, $1,200. For utilities, when we paid your rent, so you wouldn't lose this place while you were in the hospital. I picked up one of the receipts. It was from a grocery store in their town, 4 hours away. You bought groceries for yourselves and claimed it was for me. We were planning to bring them to you, Dad mumbled, speaking for the first time. When I've been home for 3 days. Mom shot him a warning look and continued shuffling through her papers. The point is, we've been taking care of your responsibilities while you were incapacitated. The insurance money was going toward your expenses anyway. My rent is paid automatically from my bank account. My utilities too. You didn't need to pay anything. She paused, caught in the lie, then pivoted with the skill of someone who'd had years of practice. Well, what about your medical expenses? Do you know how much it costs to keep someone in intensive care for 3 weeks? The insurance money was going toward that. Military medical care is free. You know that. The room fell silent, except for the hum of my refrigerator. My parents had run out of prepared lies, and were improvising now, which made them dangerous in a different way. Look, Dad said finally, his voice rough with embarrassment. Maybe we made some mistakes, but we were scared, Rolando. When they called to tell us you'd been hurt, that you might not wake up, we panicked. We thought we were going to lose you. For a moment, his pain seemed genuine. This was the father who'd taught me to throw a baseball, who'd sat up with me when I had nightmares about monsters under my bed. But then I remembered the systematic way my apartment had been searched, the careful removal of specific documents. So you decided to steal from me while I was unconscious. We didn't steal anything. Mom's mask finally slipped, revealing the anger underneath. That money has been going toward family expenses for years. Do you know what it's like trying to keep a household running on your father's disability and my part-time job? Do you know what it's like watching your neighbors drive new cars while we're trying to figure out how to pay for groceries. It wasn't your money. You weren't using it. You were off playing soldier, sending us maybe $50 at Christmas, if we were lucky. We're your parents, Rolando. We raised you, fed you, put a roof over your head for 18 years. Don't we deserve something? The entitlement in her voice was breathtaking. I'd been playing soldier in Afghanistan, watching friends die, getting my brain scrambled by an IED, and she thought I owed them for raising me. What about the medals? She deflated slightly, some of the fight going out of her. That was a mistake. We were behind on the electric bill, and your father saw them just sitting there. Sitting where? In the display case in my living room. They were just collecting dust, Rolando, and we thought maybe you wouldn't remember them, with the head injury and all. The casual cruelty of it knocked the breath out of me. They'd hoped my brain damage would be severe enough that I wouldn't notice my medals were gone. They'd gambled on my disability. I pulled out my phone and opened my browser, typing quickly. It took me less than 30 seconds to find what I was looking for on eBay. Military medals lot. I read aloud. Bronze Star, Purple Heart, Combat Action Ribbon, recently deceased veteran. You listed them as belonging to someone who was dead. Dad's face went gray. We didn't write that listing. Then who did? I scrolled through the details. Family estate sale. Veteran passed away from combat injuries. You made $847 selling my life for parts. Mom leaned forward, her voice dropping to the coaxing tone she used to use when I was in trouble as a kid. Honey, you have to understand our position. We've been struggling for so long, and when Grandpa Joe died, he left that insurance policy to help the family. You were deployed. You didn't need the money right then. He left it to me specifically. My name was on the policy because he knew we'd make sure you got what you needed from it. He trusted us to take care of his grandson. The rewriting of history was staggering. My grandfather had been very clear about his intentions when he updated his will the year before he died. He'd wanted me to have security when I came home from the wars, wanted me to be able to build a life without the financial stress that had defined my childhood. He'd seen how my parents managed money or failed to manage it, and he'd made sure his gift would go directly to me. How much is left? The question hung in the air like smoke from a grenade. Mom fiddled with her papers, suddenly unable to meet my eyes. How much of my inheritance is left? It's complicated, Dad said. There were expenses. How much? Mom's voice was barely a whisper. We've been having some financial difficulties. Your brother's medical school tuition, the house payments we fell behind on, some medical bills. How much is left of my money? Maybe $12,000 in the account. I did the math quickly. They'd stolen nearly $200,000 from me, money that could have bought me a house, paid for college, set me up for life after the military. Money that was supposed to help me transition from being a weapon of war to being a productive citizen. Instead, they'd used it to send my brother to medical school while I was getting blown up in Afghanistan. I want it back. All of it. Mom's composure finally cracked completely. We can't just give you $200,000. We don't have it. It's gone, Rolando. It's been spent on keeping this family together while you were gone. Then, we have a problem. I stood up, suddenly exhausted by their presence, by their excuses, by the casual way they'd dismantled my life. I want you to leave now, Rolando. Please, get out of my apartment. Don't call me. Don't come by. Don't contact me until you're ready to make this right. They gathered their fake receipts and prepared lies. My father helping my mother to her feet with hands that shook. At the door, she turned back to me with tears in her eyes, tears that might have moved me once, before I learned what they were capable of. We're still your parents, she said. We love you. No, I replied, closing the door. Parents protect their children. They don't rob them while they're fighting for their lives in a hospital bed. Through the window, I watched them drive away, in a car that my grandfather's insurance money had probably helped them keep. I was alone with the silence and the empty space where my medals used to hang, trying to figure out how to rebuild a life that had been systematically stolen from me by the people who'd given it to me in the first place. Sleep wouldn't come that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my mother's face as she'd justified stealing from me, heard my father's mumbled excuses. But worse than their betrayal was the growing realization that I should have seen this coming. The signs had been there my whole life. I'd just been too young, too naive, or too desperate for their love to recognize them. I got up and made coffee at 3 a.m, my hands still shaky from the confrontation. In the pre-dawn darkness of my apartment, surrounded by the evidence of their theft, I let myself remember what I'd spent 20 years trying to forget. The pattern started early. I was 8 when I found my report card in the trash, straight A's crumpled up and discarded, while Marcus's C-average report hung on the refrigerator with a gold star. When I asked Mom why mine wasn't displayed, she'd sighed like I was being difficult. "Honey, we don't want to make Marcus feel bad about his grades. You know how sensitive he is." Even then, I'd understood the logic. My achievements were supposed to be invisible, so they wouldn't overshadow my brother's mediocrity. I was the expendable one, the child whose needs could be sacrificed for the family's emotional equilibrium. The financial aspects had been subtler, but constant. When I'd wanted to join Little League, the registration fee was too expensive right now, but somehow they'd found the money for Marcus's karate lessons the same week. When I'd asked for a bicycle for my 10th birthday, I'd been told bikes were dangerous and unnecessary, while Marcus got a brand new BMX bike because he'd been working so hard in school. I'd learned not to ask for things. I'd learned that my wants were burdens and my needs were inconveniences. When other kids talked about family vacations, I'd make up stories rather than admit we'd never taken any, because Rolando gets on long drives and it was easier to stay home than deal with my supposed motion sickness. The emotional manipulation had been even worse. When I'd won the state science fair in 6th grade, beating out kids from schools with actual science programs, Mom's first response had been worry. "Now, the other kids are going to think you're showing off," she'd said, frowning at my trophy. "You need to be more humble about these things." She'd hidden the trophy in my closet so visitors wouldn't see it and think badly of our family's values. But when Marcus had gotten honorable mention in a local art contest, she'd called every relative we had to brag about his artistic talent. High school had been the worst. My grades were good enough for scholarships, full rides to several state schools, but applying for college had been putting on airs and thinking I was better than the family. When guidance counselors had called to discuss my options, Mom had told them we couldn't afford the application fees. I'd worked part-time jobs throughout high school, saving every penny for college applications and fees. But somehow, my savings kept disappearing from my bedroom hiding places. $20 here, $50 there, always with reasonable explanations. "We needed gas money for your brother's doctor appointment," or "the electric bill was higher than we expected." By senior year, I'd saved enough to apply to exactly one school, and even then, I'd had to hide the money in my locker at school to keep it safe. When I'd gotten accepted with a partial scholarship, the conversation at dinner had been illuminating. "College," his expensive dad had said, not looking up from his meatloaf. "Maybe you should think about getting a job instead, helping the family out." "I can work part-time while I'm in school," I'd replied, 17 and still believing I could negotiate my way into their support. "Marcus is starting his senior year," Mom had added. "He's going to need our attention and resources. It wouldn't be fair to divide our focus." The message was clear. Marcus's high school graduation was more important than my college education. My future was supposed to be sacrificed so he could have their undivided support during his final year of mediocre academic performance. That's when I'd walked into the Marine Corps recruiting station, not out of patriotism or a desire to serve, though those came later, but out of desperation. The military offered what my family never had: a clear path forward that didn't depend on their approval or support. The recruiter, Staff Sergeant Williams, had been the first adult to ever look at my grades and accomplishments and see potential instead of problems. When I'd told him about my situation at home, he'd nodded with understanding. "Some families don't know how to let their kids succeed," he'd said. "The Marines will teach you that your worth isn't determined by other people's limitations." Signing the enlistment papers had been the first decision I'd ever made without asking permission. When I'd told my parents, the reaction had been swift and predictable. "You're being selfish," Mom had said, tears streaming down her face. "What about us? What about Marcus? How is he supposed to handle you being gone?" Even my decision to serve my country had been framed as abandonment of them. I was being selfish for choosing a career that might get me killed, instead of staying home to subsidize their lifestyle and provide emotional support for my brother's fragile ego. Boot camp had been a revelation. For the first time in my life, I was judged on my performance, not on how my success might affect someone else's feelings. When I'd excelled at marksmanship, my drill instructors had pushed me to excel further. When I'd shown leadership potential, they'd given me more responsibility, not less. The Marines had taught me what family was supposed to feel like. We protected each other, sacrificed for each other, celebrated each other's successes, without jealousy or resentment. When Corporal Martinez had been promoted, we'd thrown him a party. When I'd earned my combat action ribbon, my squad had treated it like their own victory. That's what made the theft of my medals so devastating. They weren't just pieces of metal, they were proof that I'd finally found a family that valued me. A place where my worth wasn't diminished to make others feel better about themselves. Sitting in my kitchen, as dawn broke over the city, I understood that my parents' betrayal wasn't an aberration. It was the culmination of 24 years of treating me as a resource to be exploited, rather than a son to be loved. The insurance money, the medals, the systematic theft, it was all just the latest version of the same pattern that had defined my childhood. The difference now was that I wasn't 8 years old anymore. I wasn't dependent on their approval or trapped in their house. I was a Marine veteran with rights, resources, and the training to fight back. For the first time since discovering the theft, I felt something other than pain and betrayal. I felt angry. And anger, I'd learned in the desert, could be a very useful tool when properly directed. The sun was fully up now, painting my apartment in warm light that made the empty display case look less like a wound and more like space waiting to be filled. I reached for my phone and started making calls. It was time to find out exactly how much they'd stolen and what I could do to get it back. More importantly, it was time to stop being the family scapegoat and start being the Marine they'd trained me to be. The photograph had survived their theft, hidden in my dresser drawer beneath a stack of civilian clothes I rarely wore. The unit photo from my second deployment showed 23 Marines in full combat gear, grinning at the camera, despite the dust and exhaustion etched on our faces. We'd been halfway through our rotation, still cocky enough to believe we were invincible, still young enough to think the war would end with clear victories and ticker-tape parades. I traced my finger along the faces, remembering their names, their stories, their dreams. Corporal Danny Martinez from East LA, who'd planned to use his GI Bill to become a teacher. Lance Corporal Sarah Chen from Seattle, who'd wanted to be a veterinarian and sent half her paycheck home to help her grandmother. Staff Sergeant Michael Torres from Texas, a career Marine who'd already survived 2 previous deployments and knew how to keep us alive. 8 of the Marines in that photo hadn't made it home. The IED that had scrambled my brain had been the last in a series of attacks that had decimated our unit over the course of 6 months. Each death had been a piece of my soul carved away. Each funeral, a reminder that survival was often just luck, disguised as skill. But the bonds we'd forged had been real. When Martinez had gotten a Dear John letter from his girlfriend back home, we'd pooled our money to buy him a satellite phone call home to his little sister. When Chen had been struggling with the heat and the constant threat of death, Torres had quietly arranged for her to rotate to a safer position, without making it seem like favoritism. When I'd been promoted to corporal, they'd thrown me a party in our makeshift recreation tent, complete with a cake made from MRE crackers and peanut butter. That's what family looked like. People who had your back without expecting something in return. Who celebrated your successes because they genuinely cared about your happiness. Who would literally die for you, not out of obligation but out of love. The Bronze Star had been earned. On March 15, 2019, we'd been escorting a convoy through a particularly dangerous stretch of road when the lead vehicle hit an IED. The explosion had flipped the Humvee and trapped Martinez underneath, his legs pinned and fuel leaking everywhere. The smell of gasoline and burning rubber had filled the air while enemy fire started pouring in from the surrounding buildings. Standard protocol was to establish a perimeter and wait for reinforcements. But Martinez was screaming, and the fuel was pooling around electrical sparks. And waiting meant watching him burn alive. I'd made the decision without thinking, sprinting across 30 yards of open ground under enemy fire to reach the overturned vehicle. Torres had provided covering fire, while I'd dug frantically with my hands, trying to move the twisted metal that had trapped my friend. When that hadn't worked, I'd used a piece of debris as a lever, my shoulder screaming in protest as I'd lifted enough weight for Martinez to crawl free. We'd dragged him to safety just seconds before the Humvee had exploded, the fireball singeing my eyebrows and the shockwave throwing us both to the ground. Martinez had survived with 2 broken legs and a concussion. I'd earned a Bronze Star and the kind of pride that couldn't be bought or sold. The Purple Heart had come later, during what should have been a routine patrol. We'd been checking on a school that had been rebuilt with American aid money, bringing supplies and making sure the local kids felt safe enough to attend classes. It had been one of the good days, the kind where you remembered why we were fighting. Then Chen had stepped on a pressure plate, and everything had gone white. The IED had been buried in the school's playground, hidden under a thin layer of dirt and debris. When it detonated, Chen had absorbed most of the blast, dying instantly. I'd been close enough that the shrapnel had torn through my left arm and shoulder, close enough to be knocked unconscious by the concussion. When I'd woken up, in the field hospital, Torres had been sitting by my bed with tears in his eyes. She was going to apply to vet school when we got back, he'd said. Had all the paperwork filled out already. The Purple Heart had been a small comfort for a devastating loss. It meant I'd bled in service of my country, that my sacrifice had been officially recognized. But more than that, it meant I'd been there when Chen had needed me, that I'd shared the danger that had claimed her life. My parents had sold that medal, Chen's memory, Martinez's life, the brotherhood that had sustained me through the worst moments of my existence for $247 on eBay, to someone who probably hung it on their wall as a conversation piece, never knowing it represented a 20-year-old veterinary student who dreamed of healing animals and had died protecting children. The combat action ribbon had been the easiest medal to earn and the hardest to live with. It simply meant I'd engaged the enemy in direct combat, that I'd pulled the trigger when necessary, that I'd killed other human beings in service of my mission. There was no ceremony for that ribbon, no proud moment of recognition. It was just an acknowledgement of a line crossed, a innocence lost. But even that marker of moral complexity had meant something to me. It meant I'd done my job when it mattered, that I'd been effective when my Marines' lives had depended on my training and judgment. It represented the weight of command, the burden of making life and death decisions in split seconds. All of these medals, all of these memories, all of this meaning reduced to a few $100s in my parents' checking account. I put the photograph back in the drawer and walked to my empty display case. The dust outlines were still there, perfect shadows of the honors that should have been hanging there. But looking at those empty spaces now, I felt something different from the rage and betrayal that had consumed me for the past 2 days. I felt the calm determination that had carried me through 3 deployments, the same mindset that had helped me save Martinez, survive Chun's death, and lead my Marines through situations where hesitation meant death. My parents had stolen my medals, but they couldn't steal what those medals represented. They couldn't take away the moment I'd chosen courage over safety, or the bonds I'd forged with people who'd been willing to die for each other. More importantly, they'd made a critical, tactical error. They'd assumed that because they'd raised me, they understood me. They'd treated me like the compliant, self-sacrificing child I'd once been, not recognizing that the Marines had forged me into something different. I was still that child's core, still the person who valued honor, loyalty, and sacrifice. But now I had the tools and training to fight for those values, instead of just suffering for them. My phone buzzed with a text from Sergeant Torres, who'd been checking on me since word of my injury had spread through our network of veterans. "How are you holding up, brother? Heard you got your bell rung pretty good." I stared at his message for a long time, thinking about the different definitions of family. Torres had been in my life for 4 years, had known me only in the context of war and brotherhood. But he'd driven 6 hours to visit me in the hospital, had offered to help with anything I needed, had never asked for anything in return except the privilege of continuing to call me brother. My parents had known me for 24 years, and had used my brain surgery as an opportunity to rob me. I typed back, "Getting stronger every day. Could use some advice on a family situation if you have time to talk." His response came immediately. "Always got time for family. What's the situation, family? Not blood relatives who'd exploit my vulnerability, but chosen family who'd proven their loyalty in the crucible of combat." Torres would understand the significance of what had been stolen, would help me figure out how to fight back. Because that's what Marines do. We adapt, we overcome, and we never leave a brother behind, even when that brother needs to be rescued from the people who'd given birth to him. The insurance document that had been hidden behind my Purple Heart held more secrets than I'd initially realized. After my conversation with Torres, I'd spread it out on my kitchen table under the bright overhead light, reading every line with the attention to detail the Marines had drilled into me. What I'd thought was a simple beneficiary notification was actually something much more complex and damning. The letterhead was from Patriot Life Insurance Company, dated September 15, 2020. But as I read more carefully, I discovered this wasn't the original notification. This was a beneficiary update and payment status review, which meant there had been earlier correspondence that my parents had apparently intercepted. The document outlined the full terms of my grandfather's policy. Joseph McGregor, Staff Sergeant, U.S. Army, retired, had purchased a $850,000 life insurance policy specifically designed for military families. The policy included a provision that if the beneficiary was serving in active combat, payments would be held in a trust account until their safe return and medical clearance. That explained everything. My grandfather had died in 2019, while I was in the middle of my third deployment. The insurance company had been legally required to hold the payments until I was stateside and medically cleared for civilian life. My parents had somehow convinced the company that they were authorized to receive the payments on my behalf. But there was more. Attached to the main document with a paperclip was a smaller form titled Temporary Guardian Authorization. My hands shook as I read the details. My parents had submitted medical documentation claiming I was mentally incapacitated due to combat-related PTSD and unable to manage financial affairs. They'd provided what appeared to be a doctor's evaluation, stating I was a danger to myself and others. The date on the form was March 2028, months before my actual injury. They'd been planning this theft while I was still deployed, still actively serving, still putting my life on the line for my country. I grabbed my phone and called Torres back, my voice tight with fury. They didn't just steal from me while I was in the hospital, I said without preamble. They've been setting this up for years. What do you mean, brother? I explained the Guardian authorization, the fake medical reports, the systematic way they'd positioned themselves to intercept my inheritance. Torres listened without interruption, his breathing getting heavier as I described each new layer of betrayal. Those motherfuckers, he said finally. Rolando, this isn't just theft. This is fraud on a massive scale. They committed felonies to steal from a deployed Marine. There's more. I'd been dreading this part, but Torres needed to know the full scope. I think they've been forging my signature on the monthly payment authorizations. The insurance company would have required beneficiary confirmation for ongoing payments. Have you checked your credit report? If they'd been forging your signature, they might have been opening other accounts in your name. I hadn't thought of that. Over the next hour, Torres walked me through accessing my credit reports online, and what we found made my stomach turn. 3 credit cards I'd never applied for, all maxed out. A personal loan for $15,000 that I'd apparently taken out last year while deployed. A car loan for a vehicle I'd never seen. My parents hadn't just stolen my inheritance, they'd been systematically destroying my credit and identity for years. This is organized crime level shit, Torres said. You need to call the police, like yesterday. But there was something else I needed to understand first. I pulled out my grandfather's funeral program, the one document they'd returned to my apartment. Maybe they'd thought it was harmless, just a sentimental keepsake. But I remembered now why I'd kept it. My grandfather had given a speech at his retirement ceremony that had stuck with me. He'd talked about the difference between earning something and inheriting it, about the responsibility that came with both. I'd written notes in the margin of the program about things he'd said to me privately after the ceremony. There, in my own handwriting from 2 years ago, was the key piece of information I'd been missing. Grandpa Joe said the insurance money comes with conditions. Has to be used for education, housing, or starting a business. Can't just be spent on family expenses. The insurance policy had specific restrictions on how the money could be used. My grandfather had structured it to ensure I would use the inheritance to build a future, not just subsidize someone else's lifestyle. My parents had not only stolen the money, they'd violated the explicit terms of his gift. I called the insurance company's beneficiary services line, my heart pounding as I navigated through the automated system. When I finally reached a human being, I explained who I was and asked about the status of my grandfather's policy. Mr. McGregor, yes, I see your account here. We've been making monthly distributions to your authorized representatives since September 2020. Is there a problem with the payments? I never authorized any representatives. I was deployed when my grandfather died, and I never signed any paperwork giving my parents permission to collect my inheritance. The silence on the other end stretched uncomfortably long. Sir, I'm going to need to transfer you to our fraud investigation department. Please hold. 20 minutes later, I was talking to an investigator named Rebecca Chen, who asked me to email copies of everything I'd found. Within an hour, she called me back with information that made everything crystal clear. Mr. McGregor, the medical documentation used to establish your parents as temporary guardians appears to have been falsified. The doctor whose signature is on the evaluation states he never treated you and never provided any such assessment. Additionally, the letterhead and medical license numbers don't match our verification system, so they forged medical records to steal my inheritance. That's what it looks like. We're going to freeze all further payments immediately and begin a full investigation. You should know that insurance fraud is a federal crime, particularly when it involves military benefits. The penalties are severe. After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen feeling like I'd been hit by another IED. The theft was so much worse than I'd initially understood. This wasn't desperate parents making a bad decision. This was a carefully orchestrated criminal conspiracy that had been years in the making. They'd used my military service against me, counting on my absence and the respect people have for military families to avoid scrutiny. They'd forged medical documents to make me look mentally unstable, then used that fabricated diagnosis to justify stealing from me. They'd opened credit accounts in my name, destroying my financial future while I was risking my life in Afghanistan. And they'd done it all while sending me care packages and letters telling me how proud they were of my service. The worst part was the timing. They'd started this process while I was deployed, while I was writing them letters about missing home and looking forward to coming back to family. I'd been homesick for people who were systematically destroying my life. But as I sat there processing the magnitude of their betrayal, I felt something unexpected alongside the rage and pain. I felt relief. Finally, I understood what I was dealing with. This wasn't about family dysfunction or misguided love. This was about criminals who happened to share my DNA. And criminals could be stopped. I picked up my phone and dialed 911. The operator answered. I took a deep breath and said the words that would change everything. I need to report a fraud case. My parents have been stealing my identity and military benefits for years, and I have documentation proving it. My war with my family was about to become official. Detective Sarah Morrison arrived at my apartment 40 minutes after my 911 call. A compact woman in her 40s with sharp eyes and the kind of focused attention that reminded me of the best officers I'd served under. She listened to my story without interruption, taking notes in a careful script while I laid out the evidence on my coffee table. This is extensive, she said finally, photographing each document with her phone. Financial fraud, identity theft, forgery of medical records. Swear. Looking at multiple felonies here. The fact that you're a disabled veteran makes some of these charges federal crimes. She explained the next steps. Filing formal reports, working with the insurance company's investigators, tracking down every account they'd opened in my name. It would be a long process, but the evidence was solid enough that she was confident about prosecution. One thing I need to tell you, she said as she gathered her materials. Cases like this family financial abuse, they get ugly fast. Your parents are going to hire lawyers. They're going to claim they were trying to help you. And they're going to make you out to be an ungrateful son. Are you prepared for that? I thought about Torres, about Chen, about Martinez, about the Marines who died believing they were fighting for something honorable. Detective Morrison, I've been through 3 combat deployments. I think I can handle my parents' lawyers. After she left, I called the insurance company back and asked for a complete accounting of where my money had gone. Rebecca Chen had promised to trace every payment, every withdrawal, every transfer. When the report arrived by email 2 hours later, it was 23 pages of financial devastation. The money had gone everywhere except where my grandfather had intended. Instead of education, housing, or business investment, my inheritance had funded a lifestyle my parents had never been able to afford on their own income. March 2020, $3,200. To First National Bank, marked as debt consolidation. April 2020, $3,200. To Marcus McGregor, my brother, marked as educational expenses. May 2020, $3,200 to Riverside Motors, marked as transportation assistance. Month after month, the pattern continued. My money had paid off their credit cards, funded my brother's medical school tuition, bought them a newer car, covered luxury expenses they'd convinced themselves were necessities. In 4.5 years, they'd burned through nearly $200,000 of my inheritance, but the most infuriating entries were the ones marked family support for deployed soldier. They'd actually categorized some of the spending as helping me while I was overseas. The money they'd used to buy a new washer and dryer was listed as care package supplies. The vacation they'd taken to Florida was documented as stress relief due to son's combat deployment. They'd not only stolen from me, they'd convinced themselves they were heroes for doing it. I called Marcus next, my younger brother, who'd apparently been living off my inheritance without knowing it. The phone rang 4 times before he answered, his voice cautious. Rolando, how are you feeling? Mom said you were having some memory problems from the surgery. Of course she had. Already working to discredit me before I could tell my side of the story. My memory is fine, Marcus. In fact, it's gotten remarkably clear about some things. Like how you paid for medical school. The silence stretched long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up. Finally, what do you mean? I mean the $47,000 that's been transferred to your account over the past 3 years. Money that came from Grandpa Joe's life insurance policy. Money that was supposed to be mine. That's impossible. Mom and Dad said that money was from Grandpa's savings account. Money he'd left for the whole family. The genuine confusion in his voice told me everything I needed to know. Marcus wasn't a co-conspirator, he was another victim of our parents' lies. A beneficiary of theft he hadn't known was theft. Marcus, Grandpa Joe left me a life insurance policy worth $850,000. Mom and Dad have been collecting monthly payments for years, telling the insurance company I was mentally incompetent. They'd been using my money to pay for your education while I was getting blown up in Afghanistan. I heard him sink into a chair, heard his breathing change. Jesus Christ, Rolando, I swear I didn't know. They always said you didn't need help, that you were strong enough to make it on your own. They told me you were struggling academically and needed their full attention and resources. And they told me you were too proud to accept family help, that you wanted to make it without support from home. The manipulation was breathtaking in its completeness. They'd kept us divided by telling us exactly what we needed to hear to maintain the lie. I was the self-sufficient older brother who didn't need help. Marcus was the struggling younger son who required extra support. They'd engineered our relationship to prevent us from comparing notes. Marcus, I need you to understand something. I'm not angry with you. You didn't know where the money was coming from, and you didn't ask them to steal it. But I need to know, are you willing to help me prove what they did? What do you need? Bank records showing the transfers. Any paperwork they gave you about the education, funding, anything that proves they've been lying about the source of the money. I can get all of that. Rolando, his voice cracked slightly. I'm so sorry. If I'd known, you would have done the right thing. I know that. The question is, what are you going to do now? Whatever it takes to make this right. After we hung up, I spent the rest of the afternoon on the phone with various institutions, banks, credit agencies, the VA, anyone who might have records of my parents' financial crimes. Each conversation revealed new layers of theft and deception. The car loan I'd never applied for had been used to buy them a 2021 Honda Accord, replacing the 15-year-old sedan they'd been driving when I enlisted. The personal loan had funded home improvements, a new roof, updated kitchen appliances, central air conditioning. The credit cards had covered everything from groceries to vacation trips to Marcus's medical school expenses. They'd built a middle-class lifestyle on the foundation of my inheritance, convincing themselves and everyone around them that they deserved these comforts, and they'd done it while I was living in barracks and tents, eating MREs, and dodging IEDs. By evening, I had a clearer picture of their crimes. They'd stolen approximately $190,000 in cash payments, run up another $30,000 in credit card debt in my name, and destroyed my credit rating to the point where I'd have trouble renting an apartment or getting a car loan. But I also had something they didn't expect: a complete paper trail of their theft. Testimony from an unwitting accomplice, Marcus, and the backing of both local police and federal investigators. Most importantly, I had the moral clarity that comes from being the victim rather than the perpetrator. They would have to explain why they'd stolen from their disabled veteran son. I just had to tell the truth. Detective Morrison called me that evening with an update. We've been coordinating with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. Given the interstate nature of the insurance fraud and the fact that you're a disabled veteran, this is going to be prosecuted at the federal level. Your parents are looking at serious prison time. How serious? Insurance fraud alone carries up to 20 years. Add in the identity theft, the forged medical documents, and the fact that they targeted a disabled veteran. They could be looking at life sentences if they're convicted on all counts. Life sentences. My parents, who'd raised me and taught me to ride a bicycle and helped with homework, could spend the rest of their lives in federal prison because they'd gotten greedy and thought I was too damaged to fight back. Part of me felt sick at the thought. But a larger part, the part that had been forged in combat and tempered by betrayal, felt something else entirely. I felt justice beginning to take shape. Marcus arrived at my apartment the next morning, carrying a manila folder thick with documents and wearing the expression of someone whose world had been fundamentally rearranged overnight. My little brother had grown into a man I barely recognized. Confident, wearing scrubs from his medical school clinical rotations. But his eyes held the same hurt confusion I remembered from our childhood, when he'd been caught in the crossfire of our parents' emotional games. I brought everything, he said, setting the folder on my kitchen table. Bank statements, tuition receipts, even some emails from Mom about the education fund. Rolando, I feel sick about this. I poured him coffee and sat across from him, struck by how different we looked now. He was clean-shaven and polished, the golden child who'd been groomed for success. I was scarred and hollow-eyed, marked by war and betrayal. But for the first time in our adult lives, we were finally on the same side. Walk me through what they told you, I said. Marcus opened the folder with shaking hands. When I started medical school 3 years ago, the tuition was $52,000 a year. I'd gotten some financial aid, but it wasn't enough to cover everything. I was looking at massive student loans, maybe having to delay starting school. He pulled out a bank statement showing regular deposits of $1,500 every month. Then Mom called and said Grandpa Joe had left some money in a savings account for family education expenses. She said he'd specifically wanted to help with college costs for any grandchildren who pursued higher education. How much did they tell you the account contained? They never gave me a specific number, just said there was enough to help with school, and that I should be grateful for Grandpa's foresight. When I asked to see the account details, Mom said it was complicated because the money was tied up in investments and estate stuff. I did the math quickly. At $1,500 per month for 3 years. Marcus had received $54,000 of my inheritance, enough to cover his entire tuition with some left over. Money that should have been helping me transition to civilian life had instead been funding my brother's medical career. Did you ever wonder why I wasn't getting help from the same fund? Marcus flushed with embarrassment. I asked about that. Mom said you were too proud to accept family money, that you'd specifically told them you wanted to make it on your own. She said offering you help would just hurt your feelings and make you feel like we thought you couldn't handle civilian life. The lie was so perfectly crafted that I almost admired its elegance. My parents had used my military pride against me, convincing my brother that offering help would be an insult rather than support. They'd turned my greatest strength into a weapon for isolating me from family resources. What about Dad? What did he say about all this? You know Dad. He just went along with whatever Mum decided. But he did mention once that you were probably making good money as a sergeant, and that military benefits meant you didn't need as much help as civilian students. Another carefully constructed lie. Enlisted military pay was decent, but hardly luxurious, and my combat deployments had left me with limited opportunities to save money or build civilian job skills. My parents had convinced themselves and Marcus that I was financially secure while they systematically stole my actual financial security. Marcus pulled out another document. This one an email thread between him and our mother from last year. Look at this. I was feeling guilty about accepting so much help, and I asked if we should check on you. Maybe offer some assistance with transitioning to civilian life. I read over his shoulder. Mom's response was a masterpiece of manipulation. Your brother is very independent and has always been sensitive about accepting help. The best thing we can do for him is respect his choice to handle things himself. Pushing assistance on him would just make him feel like we don't believe in his abilities. Focus on your studies and let Rolando be the strong, self-sufficient man he's always been. She made it sound like helping you would be disrespectful, Marcus said quietly. Like we'd be insulting your strength by offering support, while they were stealing my inheritance to pay for your education. I swear to God, Rolando, if I'd known you would have done the right thing. I believe that. I meant it. Marcus had always been morally decent, even when our parents' favoritism had warped our relationship. The problem wasn't his character, was that he'd been lied to as systematically as I had. He showed me the tuition receipts, next. Official documents from his medical school, showing payments made directly from our parents' bank account. The amounts matched perfectly with the insurance payments they'd been receiving on my behalf. This is what really gets me, Marcus said, his voice thick with anger. They used your money to pay for my education, then they made me feel guilty for accepting their generosity. Every time I thanked them for their sacrifice, they acted like they were struggling to support me. They probably were struggling. My inheritance was the only thing keeping them afloat. But that makes it worse. They were living beyond their means on stolen money, then guilting me for being a financial burden. I spent 3 years feeling like I owed them everything for their sacrifice, and it turns out the sacrifice was yours, not theirs. The emotional manipulation had been as systematic as the financial theft. They'd positioned themselves as martyrs, struggling parents making sacrifices for their children's future. Marcus had been grateful for help that wasn't theirs to give, and I'd been isolated from a family that was profiting from my absence. There's something else, Marcus said, pulling out a handwritten note. I found this in Mum's recipe box when I was looking for bank records. I think it's a list of expenses they were planning to justify with your money. The note was in our mother's careful script. Rolando Fund, approved uses, Marcus tuition education expense, new car transportation for family emergencies home, repairs maintaining Rolando's childhood home, family medical expenses, caring for elderly parents, debt consolidation, reducing family stress, vacation fund stress relief for military family. They'd created a whole mythology around their theft, convincing themselves that everything they bought was somehow for my benefit. The car was for family emergencies that might require them to visit me. The home repairs were maintaining my childhood home, as if I had any intention of moving back. Even their vacation had been reframed as stress relief necessitated by my military service. They really believed their own lies, I said, staring at the list. Or they were practicing them. Look at the dates on some of these receipts. They were buying stuff first, and then figuring out how to justify it with your money later. Marcus was right. The timeline showed a pattern of purchases followed by creative bookkeeping, not careful budgeting. They'd been living like lottery winners, buying whatever they wanted, and then crafting explanations that made me the beneficiary of their spending. Marcus, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest. Anything. Are you prepared to testify against them, in court, under oath, about what they told you and how they justified the money transfers? He didn't hesitate. Yes, absolutely. They lied to me. They stole from you, and they made me an unwitting accomplice in their crime. I'll testify. I'll turn over every document I have, and I'll do whatever it takes to help you get justice. It's going to destroy our family. They already destroyed it. I just didn't know it yet. After Marcus left, I sat with his documents spread across my table, feeling something I hadn't experienced in years. Genuine connection with my brother. The theft had been devastating, but it had also burned away the lies that had kept us apart. For the first time, we were seeing our parents clearly, without the filters of favoritism and manipulation. Marcus texted me that afternoon. I've been thinking about everything, and I want you to know I'm going to pay back every cent they gave me. It might take years, but I'll find a way. That money was yours, and you should have it. I stared at his message for a long time. My brother was offering to bankrupt himself to return money he'd received innocently, money that had been stolen, without his knowledge. It was the kind of gesture that reminded me why family was supposed to matter, why blood relationships were supposed to be sacred. It also highlighted the depth of our parents' betrayal. They'd stolen from one son and lied to the other, poisoning our relationship with each other while enriching themselves. They'd turned us into adversaries when we should have been allies, isolated us when we should have been supporting each other. But their crimes had also given us something unexpected, the truth. For the first time in our adult lives, Marcus and I understood each other completely. We'd both been victims of the same systematic deception, pawns in our parents' financial scheme. I texted him back, "Keep your money, brother. Use it to become the doctor you've worked to be. The best revenge against them is both of us succeeding, despite their lies." His response came immediately. "Love you, man. We're going to get through this together." For the first time since waking up in Walter Reed Medical Center, I felt like I had family again. Not the family that had raised me, but the family I'd chosen to build from the wreckage of their betrayal. The legal aid office at the VA was nothing like the sterile government buildings I'd expected. Captain Jennifer Walsh, Judge Advocate General Corps, retired, had decorated her office with photos of Marines, soldiers, and sailors she'd helped. Over the years, her gray hair was pulled back in a regulation bun, and her handshake was firm enough to crack knuckles. "Sergeant McGregor," she said, gesturing to a chair across from her desk. "I've reviewed the preliminary materials Detective Morrison sent over. This is one of the most comprehensive cases of family financial abuse I've seen in 20 years of military legal aid." She opened a thick folder that contained copies of all the evidence I'd gathered: insurance documents, bank records, Marcus's receipts, the forged medical evaluations. Her expression grew grimmer as she flipped through each page. "Let's start with the good news," she said. "You have an airtight case. The evidence is overwhelming. The paper trail is complete, and your brother's cooperation gives us inside testimony about their methods. Your parents are going to be convicted on multiple felony charges." "What about the bad news?" "The bad news is that criminal conviction doesn't automatically return your money. Restitution is part of the sentencing process, but collecting it can be complicated. Your parents have spent most of your inheritance, and their assets might not cover full repayment. Captain Walsh pulled out a legal pad and started sketching what she called the prosecution roadmap. Federal charges would include mail fraud, wire fraud, identity theft, and elder abuse of a disabled veteran. State charges would cover forgery, theft, and conspiracy. The penalties were staggering, potentially decades in federal prison. "Here's what I need you to understand," she said, looking directly at me. "Once we file charges, there's no going back. Your parents will hire defense attorneys who will attack your credibility, your mental health, and your motivations. They'll claim you're an unstable veteran with PTSD who's misinterpreting their well-meaning attempts to help. Will that work? Not with this evidence. But it will be ugly. They'll air every piece of family dirty laundry, every argument you ever had, every time you've struggled with civilian transition. Defense attorneys in financial crime cases always try to make the victim look unreliable or vindictive." She explained the timeline. Filing formal charges would take about 2 weeks, during which my parents would likely be arrested and arraigned. They'd have the opportunity to plea bargain, which might result in reduced sentences in exchange for full restitution. What if they don't take a plea deal? Then we go to trial. With this evidence, it's not a question of whether we'll win, it's a question of how harsh the sentence will be. But trials are public, media attention is likely, and your family's private business becomes public record. I thought about Torres, about the Marines who'd trusted me with their lives, about the oath I'd taken to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. My parents had committed crimes against a disabled veteran against me, and they deserved to face the consequences. "Captain Walsh, what would you do if you were me?" She leaned back in her chair, studying me carefully. "Personally, I'd prosecute them to the fullest extent of the law. They didn't just steal money, they committed fraud against the United States government, forged federal medical documents, and targeted a disabled veteran. These aren't family disagreements. These are serious crimes that deserve serious punishment. But I'm not you. You're the one who has to live with the consequences of this decision. You're the one whose parents might die in federal prison. You're the one who has to decide whether justice is worth destroying what's left of your family relationships." I'd been wrestling with that question since discovering the theft. Part of me, the son who still remembered bedtime stories and birthday parties, wanted to find a way to handle this privately, to get my money back without sending my parents to prison. But another part, the Marine who'd sworn an oath to uphold justice, knew that crimes this serious couldn't be ignored. What if I just wanted the money back? Could we work out some kind of civil settlement? You could try. But understand that, without the threat of criminal prosecution, your parents have no incentive to return money they've already spent. They could drag out civil proceedings for years, claim they don't have assets, declare bankruptcy to avoid judgment. You might never see full restitution. She pulled out another document, a victim impact statement form. If you decide to proceed with prosecution, you'll have the opportunity to address the court directly. You can explain how their crimes affected you, what the theft meant beyond just financial loss. I stared at the form, thinking about Chun's death, Martinez's screams, the IED Blas that had brought me to this moment. My parents had stolen the medals that represented those experiences, sold them like trinkets while I was fighting to remember my own name. "They sold my Purple Heart," I said quietly. "The medal I earned when my friend died. They sold it on eBay to pay for groceries they didn't need." Captain Walsh's expression softened. "That's desecration in my book. Those medals represent service, sacrifice, brotherhood, things that can't be bought or sold. Your parents treated them like commodities. The buyer probably doesn't even know what they mean. We can try to track down the buyer, see if they'll return the medals. Many collectors are honorable people who would be horrified to learn they purchased stolen military decorations." The possibility of recovering my medals sparked something in my chest. Getting my money back would be justice. Getting my medals back would be redemption. "Captain Walsh, I want to file charges. All of them. I want my parents prosecuted for every crime they committed." She nodded approvingly. "Then we'll make them face the full consequences of their actions. But I want you to prepare yourself. This is going to be the hardest fight of your life. And it's going to get worse before it gets better. Ma'am, I've been through 3 combat deployments and survived an IED blast. I think I can handle a legal battle with my parents. Good, because we're going to war." As I left the VA legal office, I felt something I hadn't experienced since waking up in Walter Reed. Purpose. For weeks, I'd been reacting to my parents' betrayal, trying to understand the scope of their crimes, struggling to process the emotional devastation of their theft. Now I was taking action. I was fighting back with the full force of the law. using every resource available to pursue justice. My parents had counted on my silence, my shame, my desperate desire to preserve family relationships, despite their betrayal. They'd miscalculated. They'd raised a Marine. And Marines don't surrender when they're attacked. I pulled out my phone and called Detective Morrison. I want to file formal charges against my parents for everything they did. When can we start? I'll have the paperwork ready by tomorrow morning. Are you sure about this, Rolando? Once we arrest them, there's no taking it back. I thought about my grandfather, a career soldier who'd saved his money and planned carefully to help his grandson build a better life. I thought about my fellow Marines, who'd trusted me to have their backs when the bullets were flying. I thought about the oath I'd taken to defend the Constitution and the principles it represented. Detective Morrison, I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Let's bring them to justice. I chose the restaurant, carefully a neutral, public place where my parents wouldn't be able to manipulate the conversation or storm out dramatically. The Olive Garden on Route 23 was busy enough to provide background noise, but quiet enough for serious conversation. I arrived early, claiming a corner booth with clear sight lines to all exits, positioning myself with my back to the wall like I'd been trained. Marcus came first, carrying a briefcase full of evidence and wearing the same grim determination I'd seen on Marines before difficult missions. He slid into the booth across from me, our united front against the people who'd raised us both. You ready for this? He asked. Ready as anyone can be for destroying their family in a public restaurant. My parents arrived 15 minutes later, dressed for church and wearing the carefully composed expressions they used for important occasions. Mom had brought her purse, the enormous bag she carried everywhere, filled with receipts, medications, and the organizational tools she used to control every situation. Dad trailed behind her, his shoulders slumped with the permanent defeat of a man who'd stopped making decisions decades ago. They hesitated when they saw Marcus with me, probably hoping this was going to be a simple family reconciliation rather than the reckoning it actually was. Boys, Mom said, sliding into the booth with forced cheerfulness. This is nice, having the whole family together. We should do this more often. Dad settled beside her, eyeing the briefcase on the table like it might explode. How are you feeling, Rolando? The doctors said your recovery might take some time. I placed my grandfather's final letter on the table between us, the document I'd found in his papers after the funeral. The one my parents had somehow overlooked when they'd cleaned out his belongings. It was handwritten in his careful script, dated just 3 months before his death. Before we talk about my recovery, I want you to read something. Mom picked up the letter reluctantly, her face already tightening with defensive preparation. As she read, I watched the color drain from her cheeks. To my grandson Rolando, she read aloud, her voice getting smaller with each word. I know, your parents have struggled financially, and I know they've always seen you as the strong one who doesn't need help. But strength doesn't mean you should face life's challenges alone. The insurance policy I'm leaving you is meant to give you security when you come home from the war's money for education, a house, maybe starting a business. I trust you to use it wisely, but more than that, I trust you to know that you deserve support and love, not just duty and sacrifice. Don't let anyone convince you that accepting help makes you weak. You've earned the right to build a peaceful life. Love, Grandpa Joe. The silence stretched across the table like a minefield. Other families around us continued their casual dinners, unaware that we were systematically detonating the lies that had held our family together. He meant well, Mum said finally, folding the letter with shaking hands. But he didn't understand how complicated family finances can be. What he understood, I replied, was that the insurance policy was meant for me. Not for your debt consolidation, not for Marcus's tuition, not for your new car or your vacation to Florida. Dad shifted uncomfortably. We were keeping the money safe for you by spending it on yourselves. Marcus opened his briefcase and pulled out the first stack of documents. Bank records showing the monthly transfers from the insurance company to our parents' account, followed immediately by expenditures that had nothing to do with my welfare. Is March 2021, Marcus said, his voice steady despite the emotional weight of what he was revealing. The same day you received Rolando's $3,200 payment. You spent $2,800 on a Caribbean cruise. You told me that week that you couldn't afford to help with my textbook costs. Mom's defensive mask was slipping, revealing something uglier underneath. We deserved a vacation. Do you know how stressful it was, having a son deployed in Afghanistan? Do you know what it's like wondering every day if your child is going to come home in a body bag? So you spent my inheritance on stress relief. We spent it on keeping this family together while you were gone. Someone had to hold things together. At home, someone had to take care of the practical matters you couldn't handle from a combat zone. The entitlement was breathtaking. They'd turned my military service into justification for their theft. Made my sacrifice the reason they deserved to live beyond their means. Marcus pulled out the next document. The forged medical evaluation they'd used to establish guardianship. What about this? The psychiatric assessment claiming Rolando was mentally incompetent due to PTSD. Mom glanced at the document and looked away quickly. We were worried about you. Combat veterans sometimes have trouble managing civilian responsibilities. I was never evaluated by Dr. Richardson. I've never even met Dr. Richardson. You forged this document to steal from me while I was deployed. We didn't forge anything. The denial came too quickly, too shrilly. We had legitimate concerns about your mental state. Based on what? I was deployed, doing my job, serving my country. What evidence did you have that I was mentally incompetent? The question hung in the air because there was no good answer. They'd fabricated my mental illness to justify their theft, gambling that I'd either never discover their crimes or be too damaged to fight back. Dad finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. We made some mistakes. Mistakes. My voice carried the edge I'd learned in combat, the tone that could cut through chaos and make Marines listen. You committed felonies. Multiple felonies. For years. I pulled out my phone and placed it on the table, then dialed Detective Morrison's number. She answered on the second ring. Detective Morrison, this is Rolando McGregor. I'm sitting here with my parents, and I've presented them with evidence of their crimes. They're denying everything and claiming they were trying to help me. My parents stared at the phone in horror, finally understanding this wasn't a family interview, was a formal confrontation with witnesses and evidence. Mr. McGregor, Detective Morrison's voice came through the speaker, clearly enough for everyone at the table to hear. Have you asked them to return the stolen funds? I'm asking now. Mom, Dad, will you immediately return the $190,000 you stole from my inheritance, plus the additional money you charged to credit cards opened in my name? Mom's composure shattered completely. We can't just give you money we don't have. It's been spent on family expenses, on keeping this household running, on supporting Marcus's education. So that's a no. This is more complicated than you're making it sound. I looked at Marcus, who nodded grimly, then spoke to the phone. Detective Morrison, they're refusing to make restitution. Please proceed with the arrests. Wait. Dad's voice cracked with panic. Wait. Let's talk about this. There has to be a way to work this out within the family. There was a way to work this out, I replied, ending the call. It was called not stealing from your son while he was unconscious in a military hospital. Mom leaned forward, desperation, replacing her earlier defiance. Rolando, please. We're your parents. We love you. This will destroy our family. You destroyed our family when you decided to steal from me. You destroyed it when you forged medical documents to make me look mentally ill. You destroyed it when you sold my medals for grocery money while I was having brain surgery. We can pay you back, she said quickly. It might take time, but we can set up a payment plan. With what money? You've spent everything, destroyed your credit, and committed federal crimes. What exactly are you going to pay me back with? The desperation in her eyes was almost painful to watch. This was the moment she finally understood that her actions had consequences. That the son she'd raised to be compliant and self-sacrificing had been transformed by war and betrayal into someone who would fight for justice. We'll mortgage the house, Dad said suddenly. We'll take out loans. We'll figure something out. The house you bought with my grandfather's inheritance. The house you've been paying for with my insurance money. That house belongs to me more than it belongs to you. Marcus closed his briefcase and stood up. I think we're done here. You've admitted to taking money that wasn't yours. You've admitted to lying about the source of the funds, and you've refused to make full restitution. Marcus, please. Mom reached for him desperately. Don't let your brother destroy this family. Don't let him turn you against us. I'm not turning against you, Marcus replied sadly. I'm choosing to stand with my brother, who was robbed by the people who were supposed to protect him. You made me an accomplice in your theft by lying to me about where the money came from. As we gathered our evidence and prepared to leave, Mom made one final attempt at manipulation. Rolando, your grandfather wouldn't want this. He wouldn't want you to send your parents to prison over money. I stopped and looked at her directly. This woman who'd given birth to me and raised me and systematically stolen from me while I was serving my country. My grandfather wanted me to have security and peace when I came home from war. You stole that from me. You stole my peace, my security, and my faith in family. But you know what? You couldn't steal. She waited, tears streaming down her face. You couldn't steal the Marines, who taught me what family really means. You couldn't steal the courage they gave me to fight for what's right. And you couldn't steal my grandfather's voice, speaking to me through that letter, reminding me that I deserve better than this. I left them sitting in that booth, surrounded by the evidence of their crimes and the wreckage of their justifications. As Marcus and I walked to our cars, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before the IED blast. Complete clarity about what needed to happen next. My war with my parents was over. Justice would take it from here. The arrests happened at dawn, just like raids I'd participated in overseas. Detective Morrison called me at 5:47 a.m. to let me know the warrants had been executed. My parents were in custody, charged with federal fraud, identity theft, and elder abuse of a disabled veteran. Their house was being searched as evidence of their financial crimes. I should have felt vindicated. Instead, I felt hollow like the moment after calling in an airstrike. When the smoke clears, and you have to count the cost of necessary destruction. Marcus called an hour later, his voice shaky. They want me to post bail. Mom's attorney says they need $50,000 each. Are you going to do it? I don't know. I mean, they're still our parents, even after everything. But that money, it would have to come from the education fund they stole from you. The irony was perfect. My parents wanted to use my stolen inheritance to buy their freedom after being arrested for stealing my inheritance. Even in crisis, they were still trying to exploit money that wasn't theirs. Do what you think is right, I told Marcus. But remember that money they want you to use for bail. It was supposed to help me buy a house when I came home from war. 2 hours later, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, my mother's voice came through the line, strained and desperate. Rolando, thank God we get one phone call, and I had to reach you. You used your one phone call to try to manipulate me. Please, just listen. There's been a misunderstanding. We have documents that prove everything we did was legal. I almost hung up, but something in her tone made me pause. She sounded different, not just desperate, but frantically confident, like someone who'd found a lifeline. What documents? Power of attorney papers. Legal documents giving us the right to manage your affairs while you were deployed. We filed them with the court, and they're completely legitimate. My blood went cold. Power of attorney would have given them legal access to my finances, the right to make decisions on my behalf, the authority to collect my inheritance. If they'd somehow obtained legitimate power of attorney, their theft might not be theft at all, it might be legal. When did you file power of attorney? Right after you deployed for your third tour. We were worried about what would happen if something happened to you, if you got hurt and couldn't make decisions for yourself. The timing was suspicious. My third deployment had begun 18 months before my grandfather's death, well before there was any inheritance to steal. But if they'd had legitimate power of attorney when Grandpa Joe died, the insurance company would have been legally required to work with them. I never signed power of attorney documents. You did, honey. You were home on leave, and we all went to see that lawyer in town. Mr. Henderson, you signed papers giving us temporary authority to handle your affairs while you were overseas. I remembered that day. It had been presented as routine military family preparation, making sure someone could handle emergencies if I was wounded or killed in action. I'd signed several documents without reading them carefully, trusting my parents to have my best interests at heart. But I'd specifically asked that any power of attorney be limited to medical emergencies. I'd never authorized them to manage my finances or make major decisions about my inheritance. After the call ended, I immediately contacted Captain Walsh at the VA legal office. She listened to my mother's claims with growing concern. If they have legitimate power of attorney, this case becomes much more complicated, she admitted. Legal authorization to act on your behalf could provide a defense against fraud charges. But I never gave them permission to steal my inheritance. The question is what the power of attorney documents actually say. If they're broad enough to cover financial management, your parents might argue they were acting within their legal authority. She promised to obtain copies of the court filings immediately. 2 hours later, she called back with news that made my stomach drop. Rolando, we have a problem. The power of attorney documents on file are much broader than you described. They give your parents complete authority over your financial affairs, including the right to collect inheritance payments and make investment decisions on your behalf. That's not what I signed. The signature looks authentic. The notarization appears legitimate, and the documents are dated exactly when your mother said they were filed. I felt like I'd been hit by another IED. Everything I thought I knew about the case was crumbling. If my parents had legal authority to collect my inheritance, their actions might not be criminal at all. They might be incompetent trustees or poor financial managers, but not thieves. Captain Walsh, I need to see those documents. Something's not right here. An hour later, I was sitting in her office, staring at copies of legal papers that looked completely legitimate and completely wrong. The power of attorney was comprehensive, giving my parents authority over every aspect of my financial life. The signature looked like mine, close enough to fool a notary and pass casual inspection. But I knew I hadn't signed these documents. The realization hit me like a flashback to combat. My parents hadn't just stolen my inheritance, they'd forged legal documents to create retroactive justification for their theft. When they'd realized they might face criminal charges, they'd manufactured evidence of their authority. Captain Walsh, this signature isn't mine. She studied the document carefully. It's very close to your authentic signature. A handwriting expert would need to analyze it to determine if it's forged. The content is wrong too. I remember the conversation about power of attorney specifically said I only wanted medical authorization, not financial control. Can you prove that? I thought back to that day, trying to remember details that might contradict the forged documents. Then I remembered something crucial. Mr. Henderson, the lawyer they claimed handled the paperwork. He was my high school football coach. When I was home on leave, I ran into him at the grocery store, and he mentioned that he'd retired 6 months earlier due to health problems. Captain Walsh's eyes sharpened. If Henderson was retired when these documents were supposedly notarized, then they were definitely forged. But the notary stamp looks real. Easy to fake if you have access to the right equipment. Your mother worked at a real estate office for several years, didn't she? They would have had notary supplies. The pieces were falling into place. My parents hadn't just stolen my inheritance, they'd created an elaborate cover-up involving forged legal documents, fake notarizations, and fictional attorney consultations. When they'd realized their theft might be discovered, they'd doubled down with even more serious crimes. This makes it worse for them, doesn't it? Much worse. Document forgery is a separate federal crime. Attempting to use forged documents to avoid prosecution is obstruction of justice. And using fraudulent legal papers to justify financial crimes turns this into organized criminal activity. My phone buzzed with another call from the county jail. This time, it was my father. Rolando, you have to listen to me. Your mother's lawyer says the power of attorney documents prove we weren't stealing from you. Dad, those documents are forged. I never signed anything giving you complete financial control. Long pause. What do you mean, forged? I mean you and Mom created fake legal papers to cover up your theft. And now you're going to prison for fraud, forgery, and obstruction of justice. We didn't forge anything. Those documents are real. But his voice lacked conviction. Dad had never been a good liar. That had always been Mom's specialty. He was trying to sell a story he didn't believe himself. Dad, Mr. Henderson was retired when you supposedly had him notarize those papers. I can prove it. The silence stretched so long, I wondered if he'd hung up. Finally, he spoke in a voice I'd never heard before. Before it, broken, old. She said it would work. She said we could make it legal retroactively, that no one would check the dates carefully. So you admit the documents are forged? I admit. We made some adjustments to the paperwork to protect the family. Even in confession, he was using euphemisms. Adjustments instead of forgery. Protect the family instead of cover-up crimes. My parents had spent so many years lying to themselves and others that they'd lost the ability to speak plainly about their actions. Dad, you need to tell the truth to your lawyer. The forged documents are only going to make this worse for you. I can't. If I admit to forging legal papers, they'll add more charges. If you don't admit it, they'll add more charges anyway when the handwriting analysis proves the documents are fake. After I hung up, I sat in Captain Walsh's office feeling like I'd finally seen the full scope of my parents' betrayal. They hadn't just stolen my money, they'd committed a series of escalating crimes to cover up their original theft. Forgery, fraud, obstruction of justice, perjury, lie, requiring bigger lies to sustain it. How much prison time are we looking at now? I asked. Captain Walsh consulted her notes. With the original charges, plus the forged documents, we're talking about potential life sentences. Federal fraud with a disabled veteran victim. Document forgery. Obstruction of justice. Your parents are looking at spending the rest of their lives in prison. Life sentences for stealing from their son. As I drove home from the VA office, I felt something I hadn't expected. Pity. My parents had started with what they'd probably convinced themselves was justified, taking money from a son who seemed financially secure to help a family that was struggling. But each crime had required another crime to cover it up. Each lie had demanded bigger lies to maintain it. Now they were facing life in prison because they'd been too proud to ask for help and too selfish to accept that the money wasn't theirs to take. But my pity was tempered by something harder. The knowledge that they'd escalated their crimes right up until the moment of arrest. Even facing criminal charges, they'd tried to manufacture evidence to justify their theft. My parents weren't just thieves. They were career criminals who'd been using their own son as their primary victim. And career criminals belonged in prison. The story broke in the local newspaper 3 days after my parents' arrest. Local couple charged with defrauding disabled veteran son. By evening, it had been picked up by national military websites and veteran support groups across the country. My phone started ringing with calls from reporters, veterans organizations, and strangers who'd heard about the case and wanted to help. Torres was the first to call. "Brother, I just saw the news. How are you holding up?" "I'm managing. It's weird seeing our family drama in the newspaper." "This isn't family drama, Rolando. This is criminal activity. And from what I'm reading, you handled it exactly right." The conversation that followed changed my perspective on everything that had happened. Torres explained that stories like mine were unfortunately common in the veteran community. Family members who exploited military benefits, stole disability payments, or took advantage of service members who were deployed or recovering from injuries. "The difference is, most guys don't fight back," he said. "They're too ashamed, or they feel guilty about destroying family relationships, or they convince themselves it wasn't really theft. You had the courage to demand justice." That afternoon, I got a call from David Rodriguez, president of the local Veterans of Foreign Wars Post. He'd seen the newspaper story and wanted to invite me to their next meeting. "We've got guys dealing with similar situations," he explained. "Family members stealing benefits, parents taking social security payments, spouses emptying bank accounts, while guys are deployed. Your case is extreme, but the pattern is depressingly familiar." The VFW meeting was held in a basement room at the American Legion Hall. 23 veterans ranging from Vietnam-era soldiers to recent returnees from Iraq and Afghanistan. When Rodriguez introduced me and explained my situation, the room erupted in supportive conversation. "My sister was taking my disability checks for 2 years," said Frank Morrison, a Vietnam vet with graying hair and tired eyes. "Told the VA she was my caregiver, forged my signature on the paperwork. I only found out when I tried to apply for a VA loan. My ex-wife cleaned out my savings account while I was in Iraq," added Maria Santos, a Gulf War veteran. "Took every penny I'd saved over 12 years, then filed for divorce while I was deployed. Left me homeless when I came back." Story after story. Each one a variation on the same theme. Veterans who'd been exploited by the people closest to them. Family members who'd used military service as an opportunity for theft rather than a reason for pride. But what struck me most wasn't the prevalence of the problem, was the way these veterans supported each other. They'd formed an informal network of people who understood the unique betrayal of being robbed by family, who could offer advice and assistance without judgment or pity. "The hardest part isn't the money," Frank said. "It's losing faith in family, in the idea that blood relatives will have your back. The military teaches you that brotherhood is sacred. Then you come home and find out your actual brother is stealing from you." Rodriguez pulled me aside after the meeting. "I want you to know the Post is going to help with your legal expenses. We've got a fund for situations like this. Veterans who need assistance fighting family exploitation." "That's not necessary. I've got legal aid through the VA. It's not about necessity. It's about brotherhood. You fought for all of us over there, and now we're going to fight for you here at home." The following week, I received an envelope from the Marine Corps League, with no return address. Inside was a cashier's check for $2,500 and a note written in careful handwriting. "Sergeant McGregor, read about your situation in Marine Corps times. Your parents dishonored your service and disrespected your sacrifice. Enclosed is a small contribution toward your legal expenses and recovery. Semper Fi, a fellow Marine, Vietnam, 1968 to 1970. Similar envelopes arrived over the next few days. $20 bills from retired soldiers, $100 checks from veteran groups, gift cards and letters of support from people I'd never met. The amounts weren't large individually, but collectively they represented something profound, a community that honored service and protected its own. The most meaningful support came from an unexpected source. Chun's mother called me from Seattle, her voice shaking with emotion. "Mr. McGregor, I read about what happened to you, about your medals being stolen. Sarah wrote to me about you, about how you were a good leader who took care of your Marines." I remembered the letters Chen had sent home, describing our unit as a family, talking about the bonds that sustained us through the worst moments of deployment. Her mother had been reading those letters for 3 years, learning about Marines she'd never met but who'd shared her daughter's final months. "Mrs. Chen, I'm sorry I haven't called you. I should have reached out after you. Don't need to apologize. You were injured, you were recovering. But I want you to know Sarah would be furious about what your parents did. She believed in honor, in protecting the people who served. She died protecting children. She was the best of us. And you were her leader. You kept her safe as long as anyone could have. Don't let your parents' crimes make you forget that." The conversation lasted an hour, Chun's mother sharing stories about her daughter's childhood, her dreams of becoming a veterinarian, her pride in serving her country. We talked about the unit, about the Marines who'd been like family to both of us, about the way military service creates bonds that transcend biological relationships. "Mr. McGregor, I want to help you replace your medals. Sarah's military decorations are displayed in her old bedroom, but we have extra certificates and documentation. If it would help your case or your recovery, I can provide statements about what those medals meant to her and to your unit." The offer brought tears to my eyes. Chun's mother, dealing with her own grief and loss, was offering to help me recover symbols of service that her daughter had helped me earn. That evening, I attended another VFW meeting, this time as more than just a guest seeking support. Rodriguez asked me to share my story with the group, to explain how I'd found the courage to fight back against family theft. The hardest part wasn't deciding to prosecute them. I told a room full of veterans. The hardest part was accepting that the family I'd been loyal to wasn't loyal to me. But sitting here, talking to all of you, I'm starting to understand something. Family isn't just blood. Family is the people who have your back when times get hard. "Damn right," Frank said. "Blood relatives are born family, military family, his chosen family, and chosen family never steals from you while you're in the hospital." After the meeting, several veterans approached me with offers of practical help, job references for when I was ready to work again, a spare bedroom if I needed, temporary housing during the legal proceedings, introductions to other veterans who'd successfully rebuilt their lives after family betrayal. But the most significant offer came from Rodriguez himself. "We're starting a new support group, veterans dealing with family financial abuse. Would you be willing to help lead it? Share your experience with guys who are going through what you went through." The idea of turning my traumatic experience into a resource for other veterans appealed to something deep in my military training. We never left anyone behind, never let a fellow Marine fight alone. If my parents' betrayal could be transformed into a tool for helping other veterans, then maybe something good could come from the devastation they'd caused. "I'll do it," I said, "but I want to make something clear. I'm not going to tell people to forgive family members who steal from them. I'm going to tell them they deserve justice and they have the right to fight for it." "Good," Rodriguez replied. "Because forgiveness without justice isn't healing. It's just enabling more abuse." As I drove home from the meeting, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before my injury, a sense of purpose that extended beyond my own recovery. My parents had tried to isolate me, to make me feel ashamed and alone in dealing with their betrayal. Instead, their crimes had connected me to a community of veterans who understood honor, sacrifice, and the true meaning of family loyalty, given me a mission that mattered, helping other veterans find the courage to demand justice when the people closest to them violated their trust. My biological family had betrayed me, but my chosen family, forged in combat, strengthened by shared values, united by mutual respect, was going to help me rebuild from the wreckage they'd left behind. The media attention started 3 days after my parents' arrest, when a reporter from the Cincinnati Enquirer called, asking for comment about the war hero whose parents stole his medals. By evening, the story had been picked up by military blogs, veteran websites, and national news outlets, hungry for stories that combined family drama with military service. Disabled veterans' parents charged with stealing inheritance and war medals ran in USA Today. Family betrayal. Marines' Medal of Honor sold on eBay during brain surgery appeared on military.com. Though they'd gotten the details wrong, it was a Bronze Star, not a Medal of Honor. but the emotional impact was the same. My phone rang constantly with interview requests, sympathy calls from strangers, and offers of support from veteran organizations I'd never heard of. The local VFW post had set up a legal defense fund without my permission. Complete strangers were sending checks to help with court costs and living expenses. The attention was overwhelming, but it served a purpose I hadn't expected. Other veterans started reaching out with their own stories of family financial abuse, parents who'd stolen disability payments, spouses who'd emptied bank accounts during deployments, siblings who'd taken advantage of their military relatives' absence or injuries. Your case is giving people courage to speak up, Captain Walsh explained during one of our preparation meetings. Family financial abuse is rampant in the military community, but most victims suffer in silence because they're ashamed or feel disloyal for fighting back against relatives. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in federal court. As I climbed the courthouse steps with Captain Walsh and Detective Morrison, I saw a crowd of supporters I hadn't expected. 23 veterans from the VFW post, several active duty Marines on leave, and Marcus carrying a folder thick with additional evidence he'd gathered. Inside the courthouse, the gallery was packed with an unusual mix: reporters with notepads, veterans wearing service pins, and what appeared to be several military families who'd driven hours to witness the proceedings. The attention felt surreal. My private family nightmare had become a public symbol of something larger. My parents entered in orange jumpsuits, looking smaller and more fragile than I'd ever seen them. Mom's carefully maintained appearance had crumbled during a week in county jail. Her hair was unwashed, her face pale and drawn, her eyes darting around the courtroom like a trapped animal. Dad shuffled behind her, his shoulders slumped with the weight of finally being caught. Federal prosecutor Janet Williams was exactly what I'd hoped for. Former Air Force JAG officer who'd requested assignment to the case, specifically because it involved crimes against a disabled veteran. She'd reviewed every document with the precision of someone who understood military honor personally. Your Honor, she began when called upon. This case represents one of the most comprehensive examples of family financial abuse targeting a service member that this court has ever seen. The defendants didn't just steal money, they exploited their son's military service, his combat injuries, and his absence from home to commit a series of federal crimes, spanning nearly 5 years. She outlined the charges methodically: mail fraud for intercepting insurance payments, wire fraud for the electronic transfer of stolen funds, identity theft for opening credit accounts in my name, forgery for the fake medical documents, and elder abuse of a disabled veteran for targeting me specifically because of my combat injuries. The government will prove that Robert and Linda McGregor viewed their son's military service not as a source of pride, but as an opportunity for financial exploitation. They stole his inheritance while he was deployed in Afghanistan. They forged medical documents claiming he was mentally incompetent while he was serving his country in combat. And they literally sold his military decoration, symbols of his courage and sacrifice, on eBay while he was unconscious in a military hospital recovering from a traumatic brain injury. The defense attorney, a tired-looking public defender named Michael Harrison, attempted to minimize the crimes with language that made my blood boil. Your Honor, my clients are elderly, first-time offenders who made poor financial decisions during a difficult period for their family. They were overwhelmed by medical bills, struggling with their own financial problems, and genuinely believed they were acting in their son's best interests by managing money he couldn't access while deployed, by forging federal medical documents. Prosecutor Williams shot back by claiming he was mentally incompetent when his own military medical records show he was functioning at full capacity, by selling his Purple Heart-earned when his friend died beside him in Afghanistan for $247. Judge Rebecca Martinez had been appointed to the federal bench after 20 years as a military prosecutor. When she spoke, her voice carried the authority of someone who understood the sacred nature of military service and the devastating impact of betraying that trust. Mr. and Mrs. McGregor, you stand accused of federal crimes that strike at the very foundation of military families and veteran support. These aren't allegations of simple financial mismanagement or family disagreements about money. These are charges of systematic fraud, identity theft, and exploitation targeting your own son while he was serving his country and while he was recovering from combat injuries. She set bail at $75,000 each, amounts my parents clearly couldn't afford, with conditions that prohibited any contact with me, any access to financial accounts that might contain evidence, and any attempts to dispose of assets that could be used for restitution. As the bailiff prepared to lead them back to detention, My mother turned to look at me directly for the first time since entering the courtroom. Her mouth moved silently, forming words I couldn't hear but could read on her lips. Please don't do this to us. The audacity was breathtaking. Even now, facing federal charges for stealing from their disabled veteran's son, she was framing this as something I was doing to them, rather than consequences for what they'd done to me. I looked back at her steadily, remembering her voice on the phone, justifying the sale of my Purple Heart as necessary for groceries, and felt nothing but resolve. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded me with questions that revealed how little they understood about military, families, and the bonds the service creates. Do you feel guilty about potentially sending your parents to prison? Asked a reporter from Channel 12. I feel like I'm honoring my grandfather, who saved his money to help his grandson, and my fellow Marines, who died believing in honor and sacrifice, I replied. My parents committed serious crimes against a disabled veteran. The fact that I happen to be their son doesn't change what they did. Will you be able to forgive them? Forgiveness is between them and whatever higher power they believe in. Justice is between them and the legal system. They chose to steal from me while I was unconscious in a military hospital. I'm choosing to hold them accountable for that decision. What do you want to see happen to them? I thought about Chun's mother, offering to help me recover my medals, about Torres driving hours to support me at the hearing, about the veterans who'd contributed to a legal fund I hadn't asked for because they understood that attacks on one service member were attacks on all of us. I want to see them face the full consequences of their crimes, I said finally. They targeted a disabled veteran, their own son, when he was most vulnerable. They used his military service and combat injuries as opportunities for theft. They forged federal documents and committed identity theft. These are serious crimes that deserve serious punishment. As the crowd dispersed and the media packed up their equipment, Marcus approached me with something like awe in his expression. I keep waiting for you to break down, he said, to show some sign that prosecuting our parents is tearing you apart inside. It did tear me apart, I replied. But that happened when I discovered they'd been stealing from me for years while I was serving my country. Today was just the beginning of putting the pieces back together. We walked to our cars in silence. Two brothers united for the first time in our adult lives by the shared recognition that the people who'd raised us were criminals who deserved to face justice for their crimes. The fight was far from over, but the battle lines were finally clear. On one side stood justice, honor, accountability, and the principle that military service deserved protection rather than exploitation. On the other side stood two people who'd betrayed every sacred trust between parents and children, between civilians and those who serve, between family members who should protect each other. I knew which side was going to win. The prosecution war room at the federal courthouse reminded me of mission planning sessions in Afghanistan, maps, timelines, evidence charts, and the focused intensity of people preparing for battle. Prosecutor Williams had assembled a team that included 2 additional federal attorneys, an FBI financial crime specialist, and Dr. Patricia Hendricks, a forensic psychologist who specialized in military trauma and family abuse cases. Your parents' defense strategy is becoming clear, Williams said, spreading out documents across the conference table. They're going to claim you're an unreliable witness suffering from PTSD, that you've misinterpreted their well-meaning attempts to help, and that family financial management during military deployment is complex and often misunderstood. She pulled out a copy of the defense's witness list. They've hired Dr. Raymond Fisher, a psychiatrist who's going to testify that combat veterans often experience paranoia, difficulty with trust, and tendency to misinterpret family members' actions as hostile. He's never examined you, but he's prepared to offer general opinions about how brain injuries can affect judgment and memory. The strategy was predictable, but potentially effective. Defense attorneys in family financial abuse cases always tried to make the victim look unreliable, vindictive, or mentally unstable. They would argue that my military training had made me paranoid, that my brain injury had affected my judgment, and that I was using the legal system to punish parents who'd made honest mistakes while trying to help. How do we counter that? I asked. With facts, with medical evidence, with financial records that show systematic, planned theft rather than confused family assistance. Williams opened another folder. Dr. Elizabeth Warren is flying in from Walter Reed to testify about your actual mental state during recovery. Her medical records show that despite significant brain trauma, your cognitive function, decision-making capacity, and financial awareness remained intact throughout your treatment. Dr. Warren's testimony would be crucial. She'd documented every aspect of my recovery with military precision, including regular cognitive assessments that proved I was mentally competent. During the entire period, my parents claimed I was incapacitated. More importantly, Williams continued, we have the timing evidence. Your parents didn't start helping you when you were injured, they started stealing from you while you were deployed and fully functional. The forged medical documents claiming incompetence were created before you were ever hurt. The financial evidence was overwhelming. FBI investigators had traced every stolen dollar, documented every forged signature, and created a timeline that showed years of systematic fraud. My parents hadn't made mistakes. They'd committed calculated crimes over an extended period, but the most powerful evidence would come from an unexpected source. Robert Chen, the military collector who'd purchased my medals on eBay. Chen had flown in from Oregon at his own expense, carrying my restored medals in a specially designed case. When he'd learned the full story of how they'd been stolen, he'd become an advocate for military families affected by similar crimes. I've been collecting military decorations for 20 years, he explained during our pre-trial meeting. I buy them to honor service members, to preserve their stories, to make sure their sacrifices aren't forgotten. When I learned I'd unknowingly purchased stolen medals taken from a living veteran while he was unconscious in a hospital, I was horrified. His testimony would help the jury understand the emotional impact of my parents' crimes. These weren't just pieces of metal with monetary value, they were sacred symbols of service, sacrifice, and brotherhood that had been desecrated by being sold for grocery money. The prosecution team spent 3 days preparing me for testimony, walking through every aspect of my military service, my injury, my recovery, and my discovery of the theft. They prepared me for the emotional attacks that would inevitably come. The defense is going to try to make you angry, warned Assistant Prosecutor David Kim. They'll ask about your relationship with your parents, about childhood conflicts, about whether you've ever had mental health treatment. They want you to lose your temper so they can point to it as evidence of instability. How do I handle that? By staying focused on facts. When they ask about your feelings, you talk about evidence. When they ask about family relationships, you talk about crimes. When they try to make this emotional, you make it factual. The hardest part of preparation was reviewing the complete scope of my parents' deception. Financial investigators had uncovered evidence that their crimes went far beyond what I'd initially discovered. They'd been stealing from me since before my grandfather's death, using my military absence to commit identity theft that had destroyed my credit rating and created debts I'd never incurred. They opened 17 different accounts in your name over 4 years, FBI agent Sarah Torres explained, showing me a chart that looked like a criminal enterprise organizational structure. Credit cards, personal loans, utility accounts, even a mortgage application for a vacation property. They were using your military service record to get approved for credit, then maxing out the accounts and defaulting on payments. The scope was staggering. My parents hadn't just stolen my inheritance, they'd systematically destroyed my financial identity. While I was serving my country, every account they'd opened in my name was another federal crime, another breach of trust, another violation of the bond between parents and children. Marcus spent 2 days with the prosecution team, preparing to testify about his unwitting role in their scheme. His testimony would show the jury how my parents had manipulated both their sons, using lies to keep us divided while they stole from one and deceived the other. I keep thinking about all the conversations we had about family finances, he told me during a break in his preparation. Every time I felt guilty about accepting help with school, Mom would remind me that you were too independent to want family support. She made your strength sound like a character flaw that justified excluding you from family resources, while they were using my money to pay for your education. That's what makes it so sick. They were spending your inheritance on me, while convincing me that offering you help would be insulting. They turned your best qualities, your independence, your pride in serving, into reasons why you didn't deserve family support. 3 days before trial, my parents' attorneys approached Williams with a plea bargain offer. They would plead guilty to reduce charges in exchange for a sentence of 7 years in federal prison and full restitution. 7 years, I said when Williams called to discuss the offer. They committed systematic fraud against a disabled veteran for nearly 5 years, and they want 7 years. It would guarantee conviction and full restitution without the uncertainty of trial, and it would spare you the emotional trauma of testifying against your parents in open court. I thought about Chen offering to return my medals, about the veterans who'd contributed to my legal fund, about my grandfather's letter explaining his hopes for my future. I thought about the other military families dealing with similar betrayals, watching to see if the system would protect service members from exploitation. No deal, I said firmly. They committed serious crimes that deserve serious punishment. If they wanted mercy, they shouldn't have stolen from a disabled veteran while he was unconscious in a military hospital. Williams sounded pleased. I was hoping you'd say that. These crimes deserve a public trial and a real sentence. Your parents need to face the full consequences of what they did, and other military families need to see that justice is possible. The night before trial, I sat in my apartment looking at my grandfather's letter and the empty display case where my medals had once hung. Tomorrow, I would walk into federal court and testify against the people who'd raised me, fed me, and taught me right from wrong. I would describe in detail how they'd violated every principle they'd ever taught me about honor, family, and protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. It should have felt like betrayal. Instead, it felt like the completion of a mission that had started the day I'd taken my oath as a Marine. I'd sworn to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I'd never imagined that someday those enemies would include my own parents. But they'd made their choice when they'd decided to exploit my service rather than honor it. Tomorrow, I would make mine by demanding justice for their crimes. The trial would determine their punishment. But the real verdict had already been reached. Family members who steal from disabled veterans aren't family anymore. They're criminals who happen to share your DNA, and criminals belong in prison. The federal courtroom was packed beyond capacity. Judge Martinez had moved the proceedings to the largest courtroom in the building to accommodate the media attention and public interest. The gallery was filled with an unusual mix: reporters with laptops, veterans wearing service pins, military families who'd driven hours to witness the trial, and law students studying a case that would likely be cited in textbooks about elder abuse and military family law. The jury selection had taken 2 days. Prosecutor Williams had looked for people who understood the sacred nature of military service. The defense had sought jurors who might sympathize with elderly parents facing their first criminal charges. The final panel included a retired teacher, a nurse to veterans, a social worker, and 7 others who'd sworn they could judge the evidence impartially. Opening statements revealed the battle lines clearly. Prosecutor Williams began with a simple, devastating statement. Robert and Linda McGregor stole nearly $200,000 from their son while he was unconscious in a military hospital, recovering from a bomb blast that nearly killed him in Afghanistan. They sold his military medals, earned through courage under fire on eBay, for grocery money. Then they lied about it, forged documents to cover it up, and continued stealing until the day they were arrested. She walked the jury through the timeline methodically. My deployment to Afghanistan, my grandfather's death, and the insurance policy meant to provide security for my transition to civilian life. My parents' systematic interception of payments meant for me the forged medical documents claiming I was mentally incompetent. The IED blast that nearly killed me. Their visit to my apartment while I was unconscious. Removing my most precious possessions to sell online. This isn't a family financial dispute, Williams concluded. This is organized crime, targeting a disabled veteran by the people who should have protected him most. Defense attorney Michael Harrison painted a different picture: confused elderly parents overwhelmed by their son's military career, trying their best to manage complex family finances during a crisis. Robert and Linda McGregor are not criminals, he argued. They're frightened parents who made poor decisions while trying to help their families survive financial hardship. They genuinely believed they were acting in their son's best interests, managing money he couldn't access while deployed overseas. The defense strategy was exactly what Williams had predicted. Make my parents look like well-meaning but confused elderly people. Make me look like an unstable veteran with trust issues. And frame the whole case as a family tragedy, rather than systematic criminal enterprise. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. FBI agent Sarah Torres testified about the financial investigation, walking the jury through 17 fraudulent accounts opened in my name, forged signatures, and systematic identity theft spanning nearly 5 years. Dr. Elizabeth Warren's testimony demolished any claims about my mental incompetence. She described my cognitive function during recovery in detail, explaining that despite serious brain trauma, my decision-making capacity and financial awareness had remained intact throughout my treatment. At no point during Sergeant McGregor's recovery did I observe any indication that he was incapable of managing his personal affairs, she testified. His injuries were serious, but his mental faculties remained sharp. He was asking detailed questions about his financial obligations and making complex decisions about his medical treatment within days of regaining consciousness. Marcus's testimony was emotionally powerful. He described the lies our parents had told him about the source of his education funding, the way they'd kept us divided through manipulation, and his shock at learning the truth about where his tuition money had actually come from. They convinced me that offering Rolando help would be insulting to his independence. He testified, his voice breaking slightly. They made me believe that staying out of his financial affairs was a way of respecting his strength, all while they were stealing his inheritance to pay for my medical school. But the most devastating testimony came from Robert Chen, the collector, who'd purchased my medals on eBay. I specialize in military decorations, he explained to the jury. I collect them to honor service members, to preserve their stories. When I saw the listing for a Bronze Star, Purple Heart, and Combat Action Ribbon, I assumed they were from a legitimate estate sale. He described discovering that the medals had been stolen from a living veteran, his horror at learning the circumstances of the sale, and his decision to return them immediately. These medals represent the highest ideals of military service, sacrifice, brotherhood. The Bronze Star was earned saving a fellow Marine's life under enemy fire. The Purple Heart was earned when Sergeant McGregor's friend died beside him in a bomb blast. To sell these medals for grocery money while he was unconscious in a hospital represents a level of betrayal I can barely comprehend. My own testimony was the centerpiece of the prosecution's case. Williams walked me through my military service, my relationship with my grandfather, my discovery of the theft, and my decision to seek justice, despite the personal cost. Why did you decide to prosecute your own parents? She asked. Because they committed serious crimes against a disabled veteran, I replied, looking directly at the jury. The fact that I happen to be their son doesn't change what they did. Military service is based on honor, sacrifice, and protecting people who can't protect themselves. They violated every one of those principles when they stole from me while I was unconscious in a military hospital. The defense cross-examination was brutal, but predictable. Harrison tried to paint me as an angry veteran with trust issues, someone who'd misinterpreted his parents' well-meaning attempts to help during a family crisis. Isn't it true that you've always had a difficult relationship with your parents? He asked. I had a difficult relationship with people who were systematically stealing from me. Yes. And isn't it possible that your combat experiences have made you suspicious of people's motives? My combat experiences taught me to recognize enemies. People who forge medical documents and steal inheritance money while you're unconscious in a hospital are enemies, regardless of their relationship to Harrison tried for hours to shake my testimony, to make me angry or emotional, to create some opening for doubt about my mental state or motives. But 3 deployments and months of preparation had taught me to stay focused on facts rather than emotions. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, their faces showed the grim satisfaction of citizens who'd witnessed clear evidence of serious crimes and reached an obvious conclusion. On the charge of mail fraud, we find the defendants guilty, the foreman announced. On the charge of wire fraud, we find the defendants guilty. On the charge of identity theft, we find the defendants guilty. The litany continued through 14 separate counts. Guilty, guilty, guilty each verdict. Another step toward justice for years of systematic betrayal. When the verdicts were read, my mother collapsed into a chair, sobbing uncontrollably. My father stared straight ahead, with the hollow expression of a man who'd finally run out of lies and excuses. Judge Martinez scheduled sentencing for 6 weeks later, allowing time for pre-sentence investigations and victim impact statements. As the bailiff led my parents away in shackles, Mom turned to look at me one final time. Her mouth moved silently, and I could read her lips. I'm sorry. Too little, too late. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded me with the same questions about family forgiveness and guilt that had followed the case from the beginning. But the jury's verdict had changed something fundamental. This was no longer about family dysfunction or complicated relationships. This was about criminals who'd been held accountable for their crimes. How do you feel about the verdict? Asked a reporter from CNN. I feel like justice was served, I replied. The jury saw the evidence and reached the only possible conclusion. My parents committed systematic fraud against a disabled veteran, and they've been held accountable for their crimes. Do you have any regrets about prosecuting your own parents? I thought about my grandfather's letter, about Chen's decision to return my medals, about the veterans who'd supported me throughout the trial, I thought about the principle that military service deserved protection rather than exploitation. My only regret is that it took me so long to discover what they were doing, I said finally. Maybe if I'd found out earlier, I could have stopped them before they destroyed so many lives. But I'm proud that I had the courage to demand justice when I finally learned the truth. As I walked away from the courthouse, surrounded by veterans who'd supported me through the trial, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before the IED blast. Complete clarity about who I was and what I stood for. The fight was over. Justice had been served. My parents would face the consequences of their crimes. Most importantly, other military families would see that it was possible to demand accountability when relatives violated the sacred trust between those who serve and those who should support them. The verdict had sent a clear message. Family members who exploit military service rather than honor it aren't family anymore. They're criminals who deserve to be in prison. The sentencing hearing 6 weeks later felt like the final chapter of a war that had consumed 2 years of my life. Judge Martinez had reviewed the pre-sentence investigation reports, my victim impact statement, letters from dozens of veterans supporting serious punishment, and the defense's desperate pleas for mercy based on my parents' age and lack of prior criminal history. The courtroom was packed again, but the atmosphere was different. The trial had been about determining guilt or innocence. This hearing was about justice, how much punishment fit crimes that had violated every sacred trust between parents and children, between civilians and those who served out. My parents entered, wearing prison uniforms instead of the civilian clothes they'd worn during trial. 6 weeks in federal detention had aged them dramatically. Mom looked frail and broken, her once careful appearance replaced by the hollow-eyed desperation of someone facing decades in prison. Dad shuffled behind her with the defeated posture of a man who'd finally accepted that his lies had run out. Judge Martinez began with a statement that captured the gravity of their crimes better than anything I could have said myself. Mr. and Mrs. McGregor, you have been convicted of federal crimes that strike at the foundation of military service and family obligation. You systematically exploited your son's military service, his combat injuries, and his absence from home to commit fraud, identity theft, and theft on a massive scale. She outlined the evidence methodically: the forged medical documents, the systematic theft of insurance payments, the destruction of my credit, the sale of my military decorations. While I was unconscious in a hospital bed, your crimes required years of planning, sustained deception, and a callous disregard for your son's welfare and your family's future. You used his military service, his courage, his sacrifice, his willingness to put his life on the line for his country as an opportunity for personal enrichment rather than a source of family pride. The victim impact statement I'd written took 20 minutes to read aloud. I described the emotional devastation of discovering that the people who'd raised me had spent years systematically stealing from me. I explained what my medals had meant, not as valuable objects, but as symbols of brotherhood, sacrifice, and service that had been desecrated by being sold for grocery money. But the most powerful part of my statement was about the broader impact of their crimes. Your Honor, my parents didn't just steal money from me. They stole my faith in family, my trust in the people who were supposed to protect me, and my belief that military service would be honored rather than exploited by those closest to me. They turned my greatest achievements, my military decorations, my grandfather's pride in my service, my willingness to sacrifice for others, into sources of shame and betrayal. The defense made one final attempt to minimize their crimes, arguing that my parents were elderly first-time offenders who'd made poor decisions while trying to help their family during a financial crisis. Your Honor, my clients are not career criminals, Attorney Harrison pleaded. They're frightened, confused elderly people who made terrible mistakes while trying to navigate complex family finances during their son's military deployment. They loved their son and never intended to cause him harm. Judge Martinez's response was swift and uncompromising. Mr. Harrison, your clients committed systematic fraud against a disabled veteran over a period of nearly 5 years. They forged federal medical documents. They stole nearly $200,000 meant to provide security for their son's transition from military to civilian life. They destroyed his credit and sold his military decorations while he was unconscious in a hospital bed. These weren't mistakes, they were calculated crimes that required extensive planning and sustained deception. The sentences were everything the prosecution had hoped for, and more than I dared to expect. My mother received 22 years in federal prison. My father received 18 years. Both sentences included provisions for full restitution, seizure of their remaining assets, and permanent prohibitions against accessing any of my financial accounts. Your crimes have destroyed your family," Judge Martinez concluded. "Your son will carry the emotional scars of your betrayal for the rest of his life. Your younger son has lost faith in the people who raised him. You've earned every day of the sentences I'm imposing, and I hope other families considering similar crimes will learn from your example." As they were led away to begin serving their sentences, my mother turned to look at me one final time. Her mouth formed the words, "I love you," but her eyes held something different. Not remorse, but the bitter resentment of someone who still believed she was the victim of my vindictiveness, rather than the perpetrator of systematic crimes. I looked back at her without emotion, remembering her voice on the phone justifying the sale of my Purple Heart, and felt nothing but the satisfaction of justice served. Outside the courthouse, the media attention was intense, but different from the trial coverage. Reporters wanted to know about healing, forgiveness, and moving forward rather than guilt and justice. "How do you feel now that your parents will spend the rest of their lives in prison?" asked a reporter from Military Times. "I feel like the justice system worked exactly as it should," I replied. "My parents committed serious crimes against a disabled veteran, and they've received appropriate punishment. The length of their sentences reflects the severity of what they did. Will you ever forgive them?" Forgiveness is a personal matter between me and whatever higher power I believe in. Justice is a legal matter between criminals and the court system. Today was about justice, and justice was served. Marcus and I drove to our grandfather's grave after the sentencing, carrying flowers and a copy of the final judgment that ordered full restitution. The headstone was simple. Joseph McGregor, Staff Sergeant, U.S. Army, beloved father and grandfather. "I think he would have approved of what you did," Marcus said, placing flowers at the base of the stone. He believed in accountability, in protecting family, in honoring military service. He also believed in second chances and family forgiveness for people who earned them. Mom and Dad had 5 years to come clean about the theft, to make things right, to stop committing crimes. They chose to keep stealing until the day they were arrested. We stood in silence for several minutes, two brothers finally united by shared truth rather than divided by parental manipulation. The sentences meant our parents would likely die in federal prison. We would never have normal family relationships, never share holidays or family celebrations, never introduce them to future spouses or grandchildren. But we would also never again have to wonder if the people closest to us were lying, stealing, or exploiting our trust for personal gain. "What happens now?" Marcus asked as we walked back to our cars. "Now we rebuild. We use the settlement money to help other veterans facing similar situations. We create the kind of family Grandpa Joe hoped we'd become, people who protect each other instead of exploiting each other." 3 weeks later, Robert Chen arrived from Oregon with my restored medals mounted in a custom display case. The Bronze Star, Purple Heart, and Combat Action Ribbon looked exactly as they had when I'd first displayed them, but they felt different. Now not just symbols of my military service, but proof that honor could survive betrayal. "I've been thinking about these medals for months," Chen said as I opened the case. "About what they represent, about the Marines who earned them with you. Your parents tried to turn symbols of honor into commodities for sale. I wanted to return them with the respect they deserve." Looking at my medals in their new case, I understood something fundamental about the journey I'd taken from discovery to justice. My parents had stolen my inheritance, sold my medals, and betrayed my trust. But they couldn't steal what those medals represented: the courage I'd shown under fire, the brotherhood I'd shared with fellow Marines, the honor I'd earned through service and sacrifice. They'd tried to destroy me while I was vulnerable and unconscious. Instead, they'd taught me what was truly worth fighting for: justice over family loyalty, honor over blood relationships, and the principle that some things are too sacred to be bought, sold, or compromised. The fight was over. My parents would spend the rest of their lives in prison for their crimes, but my real life was just beginning. 3 years after my parents' sentencing, I stood in the conference room of the McGregor Foundation for Military Family Justice, surrounded by thank you letters from veterans who'd found the courage to fight back against family financial abuse. The foundation, established with my recovered inheritance and donations from veteran organizations across the country, had helped 87 service members pursue legal action against relatives who'd stolen their benefits, destroyed their credit, or exploited their military service for personal gain. The statistics were staggering and heartbreaking. Our research indicated that nearly 30% of military families experienced some form of financial abuse from relatives' parents, stealing disability payments, spouses emptying accounts during deployments, siblings taking Social Security benefits from elderly veterans. Most victims suffered in silence, too ashamed or too loyal to family relationships to seek help. But those who found us discovered what I'd learned during my own fight. They deserved justice. They had rights, and they weren't alone. The letter I was reading when Marcus arrived for our quarterly board meeting was from a Navy corpsman whose ex-wife had stolen his combat pay while he was treating wounded Marines in Iraq. With our foundation's help, he'd prosecuted her for theft and fraud, recovered most of his stolen money, and rebuilt his life around people who honored his service rather than exploited it. She used to tell me that my deployment pay was family money and that I was being selfish by wanting to control how it was spent. He'd written, "Your foundation helped me understand that being married to someone doesn't give them the right to steal from you. Military pay is earned through service and sacrifice. It's not community property for anyone to spend however they want." Marcus read over my shoulder, shaking his head with the same amazement he'd shown at every board meeting for the past 2 years. "I still can't believe how common this is. Every month, we get more cases that are just as bad as what Mom and Dad did too. The difference is, these veterans are fighting back instead of suffering in silence. That's what the foundation is really about, giving people permission to demand justice when family members violate their trust." Our approach was straightforward and uncompromising. We provided legal assistance, financial support, and emotional counseling to help veterans pursue criminal charges against family members who'd exploited their service. We didn't encourage reconciliation, family therapy, or forgiveness. We encouraged accountability and legal consequences. Family relationships that require victims to tolerate crimes aren't worth preserving had become our unofficial motto. Honor, sacrifice, and service deserve protection, not exploitation. The foundation had grown far beyond anything I'd initially imagined. We'd partnered with military legal aid organizations, veteran service groups, and elder abuse prevention agencies to create a national network of support for exploited service members. We'd helped change laws in 18 states to strengthen protections for military benefits and increase penalties for family financial abuse. Most importantly, we'd created a community where veterans could find the support they needed to stand up to family members who viewed military service as an opportunity for exploitation rather than a reason for pride. Marcus had completed his medical residency the previous year and was now working at Cincinnati Children's Hospital while serving as the foundation's volunteer medical director. He'd insisted on repaying every dollar of the education money he'd unknowingly received from my stolen inheritance, even though I'd repeatedly told him it wasn't necessary. It wasn't about the money, he'd explained when he'd made the final payment. It was about clearing the debt between us. I was an unwitting accomplice in their theft, and I needed to make that right to move forward. Our relationship had been rebuilt slowly, carefully, with the honesty that had been impossible when our parents' lies had stood between us. We'd learned to be brothers again, not through shared blood, but through shared commitment to truth, justice, and protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. The phone rang as we were reviewing applications for legal assistance. It was Torres, calling from his new job as a counselor at the VA in Columbus. "Brother, I've got a Marine here who needs your help, urgently. Her parents cleaned out her savings account while she was deployed in Syria, spent the money on a new RV, a vacation to Europe. She's homeless, living in her car, and her family is pressuring her not to destroy the family by involving the police. Send her down immediately," I said without hesitation. "We'll get her housing, legal representation, and the support she needs to fight back." "Roger that." "She's scared, but she's angry too. I told her about your case, about how you stood up to your parents and won. I think she's ready to fight." After Torres hung up, I walked to the window overlooking downtown Cincinnati. In the distance, I could see the federal courthouse where my parents had been convicted, where justice had finally caught up with their crimes. They were serving their sentences in different federal prisons, Mom in West Virginia, Dad in Kentucky, and I hadn't spoken to either of them since the day they'd been led away in shackles. Sometimes people asked if I felt guilty about sending my parents to prison, if I missed them, if I regretted choosing justice over family loyalty. The questions always struck me as fundamentally wrong. They assumed I'd had a choice between family and justice, when the truth was that my parents had made that choice for me when they decided to steal from their disabled veteran son. Marcus joined me at the window, following my gaze toward the courthouse. You know what I think about sometimes? What our family could have been if they'd made different choices. If they'd been proud of your service instead of seeing it as an opportunity for theft. I think about that too. But then I remember that we can't change the past, we can only build something better from the wreckage they left behind. The foundation had given me something I'd never expected, a mission that mattered beyond my own recovery. Every veteran we helped, every family member we held accountable, every law we helped change was proof that my parents' betrayal could be transformed into something positive. That afternoon, we received a package from Robert Chen, the collector who'd returned my medals 3 years earlier. Inside was a bronze plaque he'd commissioned for our office wall, in honor of all veterans who've had the courage to demand justice when family members betrayed their trust. Military service deserves protection, not exploitation. Honor above all. Looking at that plaque, surrounded by thank you letters from veterans we'd helped, and photos of military families we'd reunited with justice, I understood something fundamental about the journey I'd taken from betrayal to redemption. My parents had tried to destroy me while I was vulnerable and unconscious, to steal my future and sell my honor for grocery money. They'd counted on my silence, my shame, my desperate desire to preserve family relationships despite their crimes. They'd been wrong about everything. Instead of destroying me, they'd taught me what was truly worth fighting for. Instead of silencing me, they'd given me a voice that could help other veterans find justice. Instead of breaking my faith in family, they'd helped me understand that real family isn't about blood, it's about people who have your back when the world turns against you. The Marines who'd died beside me in Afghanistan had been my family. The veterans who'd supported me through the trial had been my family. The service members we helped through the foundation were my family. Marcus, who'd chosen truth over loyalty to the people who'd raised us, was my family. My biological parents were serving life sentences for systematic crimes against a disabled veteran. They would likely die in federal prison, forgotten except as cautionary tales about what happens when family members choose exploitation over honor. But their victims, the son they'd tried to destroy and the brother they'd unwittingly corrupted, built something beautiful from the ashes of their betrayal. We'd created a foundation that protected military families, a brotherhood that honored service, and a legacy that would help veterans for generations to come. Justice had been served. Honor had been restored. Real family had been rebuilt on principles they'd tried to destroy. In the end, that was the greatest victory of all, proving that love, loyalty, and sacrifice could triumph over greed, betrayal, and exploitation. My parents had taught me what family shouldn't be. The Marines, the veterans, and my brother had shown me what family could become. The future they'd tried to steal was brighter than anything they could have imagined.